Welcome to Snoozy Tour, where the past doesn't just whisper, it breathes. Here we don't just tell stories, we let history drift into your dreams. Tonight's journey takes us far beyond kings, empires, and wars. It takes us to the one thing every civilization has shared: hunger. From the temples of Babylon to the markets of Rome, from rice fields under dying suns to neon supermarkets glowing at midnight, this is the story of how humanity learned to eat, to crave, and to build entire worlds from a single grain of wheat. It's a story of faith, famine, survival, and the quiet hope that every meal carries. So close your eyes, slow your breath, and listen, because before there was power, before there was money, there was hunger, and hunger remembers everything. Before a single shot was fired in the Second World War, before tank treads carved scars across Europe and bombers traced smoke across the sky, every army faced the same quiet, unglamorous enemy: hunger. It's not the kind of headline you read in a history book. But long before bullets fly, a soldier must eat. And feeding millions of them, scattered across continents, turned out to be one of the most complex military operations in human history. Imagine the scale. In 1939, the United States had fewer than 200,000 men in uniform. Within 6 years, it would feed and supply over 12 million. Britain had to nourish an empire fighting on 5 continents. Germany, Italy, Japan, and the Soviet Union all mobilized their populations into engines of consumption that ran on calories instead of coal. Every slice of bread, every can of meat, every grain of rice was a bullet of its own, a logistical weapon in the arsenal of survival. Historians call it the supply line. Soldiers called it the belly of the army. Napoleon had said an army marches on its stomach, but by the 1940s that stomach stretched from the Arctic to the Pacific. Feeding it required ships, railroads, factories, and an army of invisible workers. Cooks, drivers, bakers, dietitians, and scientists who never fired a gun but decided whether those who did could keep standing. At headquarters, quartermasters pored over charts of calories and tonnage the way generals studied maps of terrain. How much protein keeps a man marching? How long can powdered milk last in desert heat? Could tinned beef survive a torpedoed convoy? Every answer meant the difference between endurance and collapse. And yet, while commanders obsessed over tactics, soldiers in the field obsessed over food. Letters home were filled less with tales of glory than with requests for chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes. Food was comfort. It was proof the world beyond the trenches still existed. To understand the war through its meals is to strip away the myth of heroism and see the raw biology beneath. The GI who stormed Omaha Beach didn't start the day with courage. He started it with a can labeled ham and eggs and a pack of 4 cigarettes. The British soldier who defended Tobruk did so powered by bully beef and tea. The German private freezing outside Moscow dreamed not of victory but of real bread. And the Japanese conscript on Guadalcanal would trade a rifle for a handful of rice. Feeding millions was not just logistics, it was identity. Each nation's menu mirrored its mindset. Americans, armed with industry, believed science could be packaged into a box. The British clung to ritual, boiling tea in shell craters as though empire itself depended on the brew. The Soviets worshipped simplicity, bread, cabbage, endurance. The Japanese elevated scarcity into virtue, turning hunger into proof of honor. Behind every ration lay ideology. Behind every bite, propaganda. Posters showed smiling soldiers spooning stew that rarely existed. Magazines printed recipes for victory cakes without sugar, while housewives learned to stretch meat with oats and optimism. The home front and the front line were bound by hunger in different uniforms. Yet the miracle isn't that the armies suffered, it's that they endured. Supply ships crossed oceans hunted by submarines. Field kitchens followed divisions through mud and snow. Bakers built ovens from tank parts. In the Pacific, cooks fried rice on oil drums. In Russia, soldiers boiled soup in helmets. Each meal was an act of defiance, proof that humanity could persist inside the machinery of war. There were disasters too. Spoiled meat in North Africa sickened entire battalions. Frozen rations cracked teeth in the Ardennes. On the Eastern Front, starvation became strategy. Supply lines turned into graveyards. When bread failed, men turned to barter, theft, or faith. The war may have been fought with weapons, but it was survived with improvisation. For the soldiers themselves, food became memory. Ask veterans what they recall, and you'll hear not dates or divisions but tastes. The bitterness of instant coffee, the metallic tang of canned beans, the sudden sweetness of a care package cookie. Food was emotion condensed, hope you could chew. So tonight, as we begin this journey through the world's greatest conflict from the inside out, forget the generals for a moment. Forget the flags. Picture instead a young soldier sitting in the rain, helmet on knees, spoon in hand, staring at a tin of something that once resembled dinner. Around him, the world burns. Overhead, artillery grumbles like an angry sky. And yet he eats. Because if he can eat, he can live. And if he can live, the war, at least for one more night, hasn't won. Feeding millions was the quiet miracle of World War II. A war not just of nations but of nutrition, of stomachs and souls. In the chapters ahead we'll open the tins, unwrap the mysteries, and taste the strange, stubborn persistence of humanity itself. You can tell a lot about a civilization by what it eats. And you can tell even more by what it feeds its soldiers. For the United States, entering World War II meant feeding an army that was about to move faster, farther, and hungrier than any in history. The challenge was clear. Make food that could fit in a pocket, last forever, and keep a man alive while he marched, fought, and bled. It had to be portable, unbreakable, scientifically balanced, and, preferably, edible. That impossible equation would lead to one of the strangest culinary inventions of the 20th century, the K-ration. The story begins not on a battlefield but in a laboratory at the University of Minnesota, where a wiry physiologist named Dr. Ansel Keys stared at piles of tin cans and calorie charts like a man trying to decode hunger itself. Keys was a scientist of extremes, part nutritionist, part adventurer. He had studied starvation in the Andes, measured the oxygen of swimmers under ice, and believed the human body could be engineered like a machine. So when the army came knocking in 1941, asking for a compact meal that soldiers could carry into combat, Keys didn't hesitate. He rolled up his sleeves, opened his notebooks, and started playing God with food. The result was a small brown box roughly the size of a paperback novel. Inside, Keys packed a day's worth of calories, about 3,000 of them, divided into 3 meals: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Each box contained a can of meat or eggs, a stack of compressed crackers, a chocolate bar, a packet of instant coffee, a bit of powdered drink for cigarettes, and that sacred ration book icon, one single sheet of toilet paper. It was science disguised as lunch. Keys called it the K-ration, partly for his name, partly for convenience. The army called it a miracle. The soldiers called it a few other things. Early field tests were promising, at least on paper. The boxes fit neatly into backpacks and gloved hands. They could survive a monsoon or a plane crash. They stacked beautifully in warehouses. But once distributed to actual soldiers, men who'd been raised on bacon, coffee, and mother's cooking, the experiment met reality. Ham and eggs chopped, read the label. Inside was something that looked like recycled concrete with aspirations of meat. The crackers could chip a tooth. The cheese spread glowed faintly in the dark. And yet, calorie for calorie, it was exactly what the human body needed to march another day. The genius of Keys' design wasn't flavor, it was efficiency. Each K-ration could be mass-produced for pennies, shipped across oceans, and eaten cold in a foxhole. It was the first time nutrition had been militarized. The packaging itself was a weapon of logistics. Waterproof wax paper, vacuum-sealed tins, color-coded boxes. An army of dietitians calculated the perfect balance of fat, sugar, and salt while engineers figured out how to drop them from airplanes without the parachutes tearing. Feeding millions wasn't art anymore. It was industry. But soldiers don't fight on spreadsheets. They fight on taste, morale, and the faint hope of home. Within weeks, the honeymoon ended. Letters poured in complaining about spam fatigue, about crackers that tasted like ammunition, about chocolate so dense it could dent a helmet. In North Africa, men roasted their K-rations over engine blocks just to soften the contents. In the Pacific, humidity turned the powdered lemonade into fluorescent paste. And in Europe, veterans joked that the K stood for killer. Still they ate, because hunger doesn't argue. Yet in its own strange way, the K-ration became a symbol of equality. Officers and privates, medics and mechanics all ate the same thing. There was no luxury food, no class distinction. Just the same brown box, the same stubborn calories, the same disappointment disguised as nutrition. A soldier could recognize another's suffering by the identical crumbs on his lap. Every now and then, though, the box delivered a miracle. A Hershey bar, a pack of matches, a spoonful of jam. Tiny luxuries that tasted like memory. Men traded these treasures like prisoners swapping cigarettes for freedom. And when the rare care package arrived from home, with real chocolate, real coffee, or cookies that hadn't been designed by a laboratory, it was a reminder that beyond the mud and metal, civilization still existed. In hindsight, the K-ration wasn't a failure. It was a blueprint. Its design influenced every modern military meal to come, from Vietnam C rations to today's MREs. It proved that armies could be fed by science, that logistics could win wars as surely as weapons. But it also proved something deeper. No matter how efficient the system, you can't ration the human soul. You can feed a soldier's body with cans and calories, but morale still needs flavor. So picture it again, a young American GI, crouched behind sandbags in Italy. It's dawn. His rifle leans beside him. He opens a small brown box, lights a cigarette, and chews the same chalky meat paste as the man 1,000 miles away in a jungle. He doesn't smile, but he eats. And somewhere, Dr. Keyes' invention does its quiet, unsung work, keeping history alive one unspectacular bite at a time. Morning doesn't come gently in a war zone. It arrives with the grind of gears, the bark of orders, the hiss of a cold wind carrying the smell of oil, earth, and smoke. Somewhere in that gray half-light, a soldier wakes, stiff, unshaven, wrapped in a blanket that smells like sweat and rain. Before he checks his rifle or his boots, he reaches for the same thing every man does: his breakfast. It's not much to look at. A small cardboard box, brown and square, with stenciled black letters. U.S. Army K-ration Breakfast Unit. It could be mistaken for a pack of nails or a box of soap. Inside, though, is something precious: 1,100 calories of science, faith, and compromise. He slides a knife along the paper seam, and history opens in the palm of his hand. Inside, a can labeled ham and eggs, chopped. A stack of rock-hard crackers called biscuits, though no one would confuse them for bakery fare. A packet of powdered coffee, a paper envelope of lemonade mix, 2 sticks of gum for cigarettes, and 1 square of toilet paper, folded neatly like a joke. Everything sealed, sterile, perfect. A breakfast built not by chefs but by committees. He balances the can on a flat rock and pries it open with his bayonet. The metal gives a sharp, metallic sigh. The smell escapes, part salt, part mystery meat, part industrial lubricant. It's not appetizing, but it's warm, familiar in its own strange way. He stirs it with the same knife he cleaned his weapon with last night. The eggs are gray, the ham pinkish and tired. He eats it anyway, spooning it into his mouth like someone paying off a debt. The crackers come next. They crumble like chalk and taste like despair with a hint of salt. He chews them slowly, listening to the soft thunder of artillery miles away. Every crunch feels like punctuation in a letter that never ends. Then comes the coffee. He pours the powder into his tin cup, adds a splash of water from his canteen, stirs it with his finger, and swallows. It's bitter, acidic, and perfect. For a brief moment, he could be back home, sitting at a diner watching the morning traffic, pretending there's no such thing as war. He savors it not for taste, but for what it reminds him of: peace. The gum goes into his mouth. He chews slowly, feeling the flavor fade within minutes. Still, the motion keeps his jaw moving, his mind from drifting. A small ritual in a world without rituals. He lights one of the cigarettes, exhales into the cold air, and watches the smoke twist upward like a ghost escaping. For a fleeting second, he almost smiles. The cigarette isn't nutrition, but it feels like relief. Maybe the closest thing to luxury he'll get all week. Around him, the camp stirs. Men curse, cough, yawn, stretch. A few make jokes about the meal. Someone calls the eggs wallpaper paste. Another claims he's sure the lemonade was made from real lemons, sometime around the Great Depression. They laugh because laughter is calories too. It burns nothing and gives just enough to keep going. Breakfast ends the same way it always does, with the ritual of packing away the wrappers, flattening the tins, tucking the trash into a hole in the dirt. Nothing left behind but footprints and faint steam rising from the coffee dregs. The soldier shoulders his rifle. The taste of ham and metal still clings to his tongue. It doesn't matter. He's full enough to march. Full enough to fight. Somewhere far behind the front, in a warehouse stacked floor to ceiling with boxes, men in white coats record numbers on clipboards. Each breakfast unit represents calculations: carbohydrates, proteins, fats. To them, feeding soldiers is an equation. To the men on the line, it's a prayer. Science can measure calories, but it can't measure morale. And yet, somehow this works. The human body adapts. After a few weeks, the soldier stops expecting flavor. Food becomes fuel, eating becomes reflex. He doesn't eat to enjoy, he eats to survive. And there's a strange kind of peace in that, the simplicity of necessity. When you have nothing, even bad coffee tastes holy. Sometimes, if the morning is quiet, too quiet, the soldiers trade. A pack of cigarettes for an extra can of meat. A chocolate bar for a sip of real coffee from the field kitchen. Food becomes currency, barter, communication. The shared misery binds them. And somehow, amid mud and smoke, a sense of humanity persists, carried by the faint smell of breakfast, by the crackle of cigarettes, by the sound of spoons scraping tin. The war machine is vast, impersonal, unstoppable. But for the man holding a can of ham and eggs, it all shrinks to one simple question. Can I eat this and keep going? And somehow, day after day, the answer is yes. That's how wars are won, not only with bullets but with breakfast. It looked like salvation. A neat brown rectangle wrapped in silver foil, stamped with the words U.S. Army Field Ration D. To a starving man crouched in a foxhole, it shimmered like treasure, the promise of sweetness, comfort, maybe even home. But within seconds of biting, every soldier learned the same bitter truth. This was not chocolate as God intended. This was chocolate as the army required, hard as a brick, joyless as paperwork, and engineered to survive the apocalypse. The story began in 1937 when Army Quartermaster Corps called up Dr. Ansel Keys, the same man who'd invented the K-ration, and handed him a new challenge. The request sounded simple: create an emergency chocolate bar that wouldn't melt, wouldn't spoil, and wouldn't be eaten unless absolutely necessary. Keys raised an eyebrow. You want chocolate that tastes bad? The officer nodded. Exactly. And thus began one of history's least appetizing experiments. In Keys's lab, cocoa met calculus. He mixed sugar, oat flour, cocoa fat, and just enough chocolate liquor to make it brown. The texture? Dense, grainy, somewhere between sidewalk chalk and gilt. He poured it into molds the size of a deck of cards and baked morality right into it. The finished bar weighed 4 ounces, delivered 600 calories, and could theoretically stop both hunger and small arms fire. The army adored it. They wrapped it in wax paper and tin foil, packed it by the millions, and sent it to every corner of the world. Soldiers tucked them into pockets, helmets, and ammunition pouches. It became both emergency food and a kind of superstition, a talisman against starvation. But try to chew it cold and you risked a cracked tooth. Some soldiers grated it into boiling water to make chocolate soup. Others used it as a hammer, doorstop, or bargaining chip. One private swore he carved his initials into a tree with it. On paper, the D-ration was a triumph. High energy, compact, shelf-stable. In practice, it was edible punishment. It was supposed to taste slightly better than boiled dirt, and in that, it succeeded magnificently. The army's logic was brutal but effective. A soldier should eat it only when starving, not as a snack. Flavor would be the first casualty in this particular war. Across Europe and the Pacific, men grew familiar with the ritual. You pull the bar from your pack, peel back the foil, stare at it like it owes you an apology. You soften it near the fire or your body heat, then gnaw carefully, letting the bitterness coat your tongue like despair. It's dense, dry, and somehow oily all at once. But it fills the stomach, and that's enough. When you're miles from supply lines, hiding from artillery, a taste of anything, even misery, feels like mercy. There were legends too. A rumor spread that the bar could stop a bullet. Another claimed it was indestructible. One sailor said he'd dropped his into the Pacific, fished it out a week later, and still eaten it. Historians doubt the details, but not the sentiment. The D-ration outlasted everything, even the appetite. The army eventually realized morale was suffering. In 1943, Hershey's engineers developed a sweeter cousin, the tropical bar, which resisted melting but didn't taste quite as apocalyptic. It became the prototype for post-war survival chocolate. Proof that even in battle, a little sugar could save spirits as well as bodies. But for many soldiers, the memory of that first D-ration never faded. They joked that it was proof the enemy wasn't the only one trying to kill us. Yet within that bitterness was a strange kind of affection. Because the D-ration represented more than food, it was a promise from home. Every bar had been packed by someone. A factory worker in Pennsylvania, a teenage girl sealing foil, a nation saying we're feeding you even if it hurts. It was the taste of endurance, the flavor of determination wrapped in tinfoil. After the war, veterans told stories with a grin. They'd hand their children candy bars and mutter, "You don't know how lucky you are." Museums still keep a few durations locked behind glass. Dull brown bricks of history that once rode in the pockets of boys who crossed oceans. Time has softened neither their edges nor their symbolism. They remain what they always were. Food forged in fear, preserved by necessity, redeemed by memory. So picture it again. A lone GI crouched beneath a ruined wall in Italy. Rain dripping from his helmet, fingers numb. He unwraps a bar that gleams faintly in the gray light. He bites, winces, chews, swallows. For a moment, the world is quiet. No orders, no explosions. Just the slow crunch of something terrible keeping him alive. That's the duration, chocolate that fought back, and somehow so did he. War creates its own kind of civilization. Not one of marble and monuments, but of mud, tin, and trade. Wherever soldiers gather, markets bloom, not because anyone planned them, but because hunger and boredom always find a way to organize themselves. Call it the frontline economy, where value isn't printed on paper or minted in coins, but measured in cigarettes, chocolate, and the rare taste of something real. Every army had its own currency, but none of it mattered as much as the one thing every man understood: the barter. It began with small trades, a pack of smokes for an extra tin of beans, a spare pair of socks for a clean razor blade. But soon, these little exchanges grew into a shadow market, an invisible world of deals conducted behind supply trucks, inside trenches, and under flickering lamps in half-destroyed barns. To the outsider, it looked like chaos. To the soldier, it was survival, and sometimes sanity. The rules were simple. Everything has value and nothing is free. A cigarette could buy you a favor. A chocolate bar might earn you loyalty. A can of peaches, pure gold. The rarest luxury wasn't ammunition or alcohol. It was flavor. Flavor was freedom, even if only for a bite. In the American ranks, the cigarette reigned supreme. Camels, Lucky Strikes, Chesterfields, they were more than smoke. They were social glue. One cigarette could buy you company. A pack could buy you silence. Cartons moved like currency, traded across camps, stolen from depots, even gifted to enemy prisoners who spoke the universal language of nicotine. War might divide men by flags, but the need for a drag united them. Chocolate, meanwhile, became diplomacy. Soldiers carried Hershey bars not just for sugar, but as bargaining chips. Kids in liberated towns would swarm jeeps, shouting, "Chocolate! Chocolate!" And a single bar could turn fear into friendship. In France, soldiers traded chocolate for wine. In Italy, for bread. In the Pacific, for fruit or favors. Every trade told a story of trust, desperation, or just the aching desire to feel human again. Then there was the black market, the deeper current beneath the surface. Military police tried to suppress it, but where there's scarcity, there's creativity. Cooks siphoned extra rations to trade for boots. Mechanics swapped gasoline for soap or liquor. Even officers played the game, quietly hoarding supplies for leverage. The official economy fed the war. The unofficial one kept it alive. In the British camps, the system evolved into something almost elegant. Tea became both commodity and currency. A cup could calm nerves or settle debts. Tins of corned beef, nicknamed bully, were standard trade items, though no one actually wanted to eat them. In one North African outpost, men joked that the British Empire could survive any siege as long as it had tea and someone to complain to about it. It wasn't far from the truth. For the Germans, especially as the war dragged on, barter turned darker. Cigarettes and schnapps were traded for bread. Watches for soup. Even personal treasures, rings, photographs, letters, became tender in the desperate economy of survival. By 1944, the Reich soldiers had become merchants of misery, dealing in scraps of warmth and taste. The Soviets took barter to an art form. A spoonful of sugar could buy a poem. A crust of bread, a night's sleep by the stove. When supplies failed, they invented entire markets out of nothing. Carving spoons from shell casings, turning buttons into coins. Even in famine, they traded, because to trade is to believe tomorrow still exists. And in the Pacific, the frontline economy became surreal. Japanese soldiers, starving on remote islands, would risk their lives raiding Allied camps for rice, salt, or canned goods. Sometimes, truce-like exchanges emerged under the cover of night. Food for medicine, cigarettes for silence. War didn't stop being war, but hunger softened its edges for a heartbeat. In those brief, wordless trades, enemies became men again. Behind every transaction was something more than need, it was connection. A trade wasn't just about getting more food, it was about feeling seen, having power in a place designed to strip it away. When everything is issued by command, to barter is rebellion. It says, I still decide something in this world. Even if that something is a can of peaches. Decades later, veterans would still talk about those trades with strange affection. They'd laugh about the absurdity, swapping boots for coffee or 2 cigarettes for a kiss in a French village. But beneath the laughter lay something sacred, the memory of small kindnesses exchanged in a world gone mad. Because in the middle of chaos, a single act of sharing, a sip, a bite, a trade, felt like civilization refusing to die. The frontline economy never made anyone rich. It didn't appear in history books or war budgets. But it ran through every camp and every trench, invisible and indispensable. It was the pulse of human instinct, to trade, to share, to connect, surviving even when nations tore themselves apart. So picture it, a muddy camp somewhere in Italy, 1944. A soldier holds out his last chocolate bar. Another offers him a tin of peaches. They trade, nod, and eat in silence. No paperwork, no politics, no propaganda. Just 2 men momentarily equal, proving that even amid destruction, the oldest economy in the world still holds, the exchange of one hunger for another kind of hope. You can tell when a field kitchen is near even before you see it. The smell finds you first, smoke, grease, onions, and hope. It drifts through the trenches, across ruined streets and frozen fields, cutting through the stench of mud and cordite. For soldiers who've lived on tins and tablets, that smell is salvation. It means one thing, hot food. And hot food means you're still alive. The rolling kitchen, a metal stove bolted onto a trailer, was one of the unsung heroes of World War II. It looked like nothing, a steel box blackened by soot, rattling behind a truck through rain, dust, or snow. But to the men who followed it, it might as well have been a cathedral. It carried warmth, calories, and the faint illusion of normal life in a world where nothing was normal. The cooks who ran it were rarely celebrated. They weren't soldiers in the heroic sense. They didn't storm beaches or win medals. But they fought their own kind of war, against weather, shortages, and physics. They worked by lantern light, with hands burned and blackened, turning ration cans and scraps into something that resembled a meal. They could make soup out of anything. And when the troops lined up, dented mess tins in hand, no one cared how it tasted, only that it was hot. The logistics were staggering. Each kitchen could serve hundreds of men, often under fire. Water boiled in massive kettles, steam clouding the night like ghostly breath. Inside the stoves, wood and coal fought for oxygen, sparks flying into the dark. On the menu, stew thick enough to coat a spoon, potatoes boiled to submission, coffee that tasted faintly of oil and salvation. Sometimes there was meat, sometimes not. Sometimes there was only bread and gravy. But after weeks of cold rations, even gravy felt like luxury. Cooks became folk heroes in their own quiet way. They learned every trick, stretching 1 can of meat into 20 servings, disguising spoiled ingredients with pepper and humor. They served under shell fire, ladling stew while mortars fell, their aprons flapping like flags. In field journals, soldiers wrote about them with genuine affection. "He saved my life," one private wrote, "not with medicine but with soup." Another called the field kitchen, "the only home I had that moved." In Italy and North Africa, the chuck wagon became a kind of rallying point. Men gathered around it at dusk, swapping stories, cleaning weapons, joking between bites. The fire crackled, pots clanged, laughter cut through the dark. For a few minutes, the front lines disappeared. The war shrank to the circle of light around the stove. Steam rose into the cold air, carrying with it something priceless, the smell of togetherness. Of course, not every kitchen ran smoothly. Rain could drown the fire. Mud could clog the wheels. In the Ardennes, temperatures froze soup solid inside the pots. Cooks hacked it apart with bayonets and reheated it with flamethrowers. In the desert, sand turned every bite into a new texture. One British corporal claimed he could chew Africa in every mouthful. But no matter the conditions, the kitchens kept rolling. Because to stop cooking was to admit defeat. There was hierarchy even in hunger. Officers dined on better cuts, often with a bottle of something smuggled. Enlisted men got the scraps. But when the cooks had leftovers, they shared them anyway. A spoonful of extra stew, a crust of bread, a gesture that said, "We're all starving together." In those small acts, the war's brutality softened just enough to let kindness through. Some kitchens became legends. In France, one American sergeant modified his field stove to bake pies using canned fruit and stolen flour. He charged no money, just a smile and a promise to remember home. In the Pacific, a Navy cook turned coconut milk and rice into a kind of pudding that soldiers swore tasted like peace. No medals were given for these victories, but they mattered just the same. As the war dragged on, the field kitchen evolved. Faster trucks, bigger pots, more efficient burners. It became the beating heart of morale. Generals planned supply lines around it. Chaplains blessed it. Soldiers wrote home about it like it was a person. Because when you're far from everything human, a hot meal is not just sustenance. It's proof the world still remembers you. Years later, veterans would recall the sound more than the taste. The hiss of boiling water, the scrape of ladles, the hum of voices gathering in the cold. That sound meant safety, even if only for an hour. The front lines might shift, commanders might fall, but as long as the kitchen rolled, the army felt immortal. So picture it. Night. Snow falling on a ruined village. The guns have gone quiet for now. From the back of a truck, a glow spills into the dark. Men line up, mess tins in hand, faces smeared with soot and exhaustion. A cook ladles thick, steaming stew, muttering jokes that no one quite hears. Someone laughs anyway. Steam drifts up like prayer smoke. For a fleeting moment, amid fire and ruin, the world feels almost kind. That's the miracle of the rolling kitchen. Hope on wheels. Not glamorous, not heroic, but essential. Because wars may be won by generals, but they're survived by men who can still find warmth in a bowl of stew. Before the war turned cruel, before shortages gnawed at the edges of the Reich, the German soldier ate well, frighteningly well. When the first campaigns of 1939 rolled across Poland, then France, the Wehrmacht marched not only with tanks and rifles but with a mobile pantry that could have catered a banquet. Order, discipline, and nourishment, these were the pillars of the German way of war. And in those early years, even food felt like a form of conquest. A German ration wasn't just fuel, it was philosophy on a plate. Where American meals were engineered and British ones endured, German rations were crafted. Bread, dense, dark rye loaves baked in field ovens, was sacred. Meat came smoked or cured. Sausages that could last months, tins of liverwurst and pork fat. Butter, marmalade, cheese, coffee substitutes, even small bottles of schnapps. Each item was packed with clockwork precision. It was sustenance wrapped in ideology. Efficiency, order, superiority. Officers took pride in the menus. A day's ration might include a full breakfast of bread, butter, jam, and ersatz coffee, a hot midday meal of meat and potatoes, perhaps pea soup with bacon, and an evening meal of sausage and bread again, washed down with tea or beer when available. Calories were abundant, around 3,000 per day, and morale at first soared. Letters home from the front in 1940 described plenty to eat and good. War, in its early German phase, was well-fed. Feeding an army the size of the Wehrmacht required military choreography of its own. Every regiment had field kitchens known as goulash cannons, massive steel kettles mounted on carts that looked like artillery pieces but fired only steam. They rolled behind the columns, belching smoke, filling the air with the smell of stew and ambition. To the men, those wagons were as important as the tanks ahead of them. They symbolized Germany's secret weapon, organization. Cooks, many of them trained bakers or butchers before the war, prided themselves on precision. Every spoonful was measured, every potato counted. Bread was sliced in equal portions and distributed at the same hour daily. Even in occupied territories, the food lines ran like clockwork. When civilians starved, German units still ate on schedule, a fact that both stunned and enraged the conquered. To the Wehrmacht, hunger was disorder, and disorder was defeat. For a while it worked. The Blitzkrieg was not only a triumph of speed and steel but of stomachs that were never empty. A well-fed soldier marched farther, shot straighter, obeyed faster. And in the propaganda films of the early 1940s, the message was clear. The German army feeds its sons while the enemy starves them. Meals became moral victories, proof that the fatherland cared for its own. But behind that efficiency lay arrogance, the belief that supply lines could stretch as far as conquest demanded. By the time Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, that illusion began to rot, literally. The same discipline that had kept the army well-fed in Europe now betrayed it across the endless Russian plains. Trains couldn't keep up. Cattle froze before they could be slaughtered. Bread hardened into stones. The Gulish Kanonen froze solid, their kettles cracking in -40 degrees. Suddenly, the empire that had prided itself on order met a land that swallowed order whole. But in 1939 and 1940, those disasters still seemed impossible. In France, soldiers roasted captured chickens over their goulash fires. In Norway, they feasted on fish and beer seized from local cellars. And in Poland, every occupied bakery was folded into the German supply chain. Wherever the Wehrmacht went, food followed, taken, requisitioned, or simply stolen, all under the banner of efficiency. They called it logistics. History called it exploitation. Within the ranks, though, camaraderie thrived around the evening meal. Men huddled by their goulash cannon, passing bread, cutting sausage, sharing laughter before another march. They sang songs, toasted their luck, cleaned their tin bowls with crusts of rye. For them, eating was an act of civilization, proof they were not yet reduced to savagery. It gave them a sense of control in a world unspooling into chaos. There was pride, too, in comparison. German soldiers mocked the blandness of British bully beef or the experimental paste of American K-rations. They bragged that the Wehrmacht still knew what real food was. That pride would turn to hunger soon enough, but in these early campaigns, it was intoxicating. Their stomachs, like their armies, seemed invincible. In retrospect, the German menu of 1940 feels like a time capsule, a final feast before the famine. It embodied the illusion that control could conquer nature, that precision could replace mercy, that even war could be civilized. For a moment, it almost seemed true. And perhaps that's why the soldiers remembered those meals so vividly, the buttered bread, the steaming soup, the schnapps that burned away fear. They didn't know it yet, but they were dining on borrowed time. So imagine it. A field on the edge of France, 1940. A gray truck rattles to a stop. The goulash cannon hisses like an iron dragon. Men gather, bowls ready, faces tired but proud. Steam curls into the evening air. They eat in silence, confident, efficient, certain of victory. The stew tastes rich, the bread thick. They don't yet know how fast that taste will fade. It didn't happen overnight. No empire ever starves all at once. At first, the change is subtle. A missing spice, a thinner slice of bread, a sausage that tastes slightly off. Then, slowly, the flavor of victory curdles. By 1942, the German army, once fed with pride and precision, began to eat its own myth. In the beginning, the Wehrmacht's menus had been symbols of strength. Rye bread, cured meat, butter, jam, even coffee substitutes. But as the front lines stretched deeper into Europe and the Soviet Union, the supply trains couldn't keep up. Rail lines were bombed, convoys froze in snowdrifts, and the ovens of the Gulish Kanonen went cold. In their place came ersatz, imitation foods, concoctions of desperation and propaganda. Germany, master of industry, now declared war on hunger with chemistry. The bread, once dark and rich with rye, became pale, crumbly, and hollow. Flour was stretched with sawdust, potato peel, even ground acorns. Butter gave way to margarine made from turnip oil. Coffee was roasted barley and chicory, bitter as regret. Cigarettes were filled with dried leaves and paper. And the sausage, that sacred icon of German comfort, turned sour, a rubbery parody stuffed with mystery meat and ambition. To the average soldier, these substitutions felt like betrayal. At first, they joked, "We march on our stomachs, but the stomach's marching home." Later, no one laughed. The food was still delivered, but the spirit had gone missing. Without taste, without comfort, the army's discipline began to erode from within. A soldier can face bullets. He can face death. But he cannot face months of hunger pretending to be food. Letters home began to change in tone. Gone were the cheerful reports of hearty stews and endless bread. Now they spoke of shortages, of trading rations for cigarettes, of living on potatoes alone. "Send sausage if you can," one corporal wrote from the Eastern Front. "It's cold here and everything smells like metal." The home front couldn't oblige. By then, German cities were rationing their own meager supplies. Even civilians were chewing on substitutes. Ersatzkäse, Ersatzhonig, Ersatzleben. Fake cheese, fake honey, fake life. Propaganda tried to spin it differently. Posters showed smiling soldiers eating steaming bowls of stew, slogans proclaiming that hardship was patriotism. Newspapers printed recipes for victory cakes, made from carrots and beet syrup. Women were told that feeding their families with substitutes was an act of heroism. But the soldiers knew better. No poster could make sawdust taste like bread. By late 1943, the situation worsened. The Eastern Front devoured everything: men, machines, morale. The rail cars froze. The food rotted before it arrived. Entire units survived on whatever they could find: raw potatoes, frozen horse meat, even snow boiled with salt. Men stripped bark from trees for soup. In some places, they bartered with locals for bread, sometimes with money, sometimes with bullets. The once proud German war machine now scavenged like animals. In those conditions, the meaning of food changed. It was no longer about flavor or comfort, but proof of existence. To eat was to live another day. To find warmth in a can of gray stew was victory enough. Cooks became magicians again, turning the last scraps of supply into something the men could swallow. They mixed rotten meat with onions to hide the smell, soaked hard bread in water to fake softness, added grease to everything to stretch the calories. Every meal became an act of deception, part survival, part morale theater. The officers ate slightly better, of course. They always do. But even their tables grew bare. Gone were the schnapps and sausages. In their place, tinned fish, powdered soup, and the stale taste of diminishing empire. At headquarters, generals debated strategy while chewing bread that broke their teeth. The irony was hard to miss. The architects of Blitzkrieg defeated not by bullets but by hunger. By 1944, the German word Ersatz had become more than a label. It was a state of being, a life diluted, stretched, faked. The same word that described their food described their future. Ersatz faith, ersatz victory, ersatz hope. Every imitation carried the taste of loss. Yet even amid famine, the soldiers clung to ritual. They still shared their last bread, still toasted birthdays with cups of boiled chicory, still laughed when the sausage refused to die in the pan. That stubborn humor, black as their coffee, kept them human. Because when everything real has been taken, laughter becomes nourishment. Somewhere near Smolensk, a German cook wrote in his diary, "We have no flour, no salt, no meat. I boiled the boots today." The men cheered. They said it tastes like home. Home. That was the flavor they were really chasing. The memory of Sunday bread, the smell of pork and onions, the sound of forks against plates. Those things had become ghosts, haunting every meal. By the winter of 1944, hunger was no longer an inconvenience. It was policy. The Reich had overreached. The supply lines were ash. The empire that once fed its soldiers with pride now devoured itself, one ration at a time. So picture it. A trench on the Eastern Front. Snow falling, slow and thick. A soldier unwraps a sausage, thin, pale, and sour. He sniffs it, hesitates, then eats anyway. The taste is awful, but he keeps chewing. Because he has to. Because the war won't stop for hunger. Because if he can still taste something, anything, he's still alive. That's when he realizes, the empire isn't dying on the battlefield. It's dying in his mouth. The maps show territory. The diaries show hunger. Every line drawn eastward in 1941 was another meal stretched thinner, another soldier marching farther away from the kitchens that kept him human. By the time the Wehrmacht reached the gates of Moscow, the greatest army in Europe was already starving. You can't blitzkrieg on an empty stomach. Winter hit like a wall. Trains froze on their tracks, wheels fused to steel. Fuel gelled in barrels, meat solidified into bricks. Bread arrived days late and days harder. A slice could break teeth. Canned stew had to be thawed over candles or engine blocks. Men chipped at their rations with bayonets, each clink echoing like distant gunfire. They joked that the only thing warm in Russia was misery itself. The Gulish Kanonen, those proud rolling kitchens that once fed thousands, were now useless lumps of iron buried in snow. Firewood was rarer than ammunition. Cooks boiled whatever they could find: potato peels, frozen carrots, horse bones stripped of meat, even straw soaked in salt water to mimic soup. When the wind howled across the steppe, the pots went silent. Smoke gave away positions. To eat was to risk death. To starve was certain. Letters home began to read like confessions. "We fight the Russians by day," one corporal wrote, "and our stomachs by night. We dream of bread more than victory." Another simply said, Send anything edible. The army that once prided itself on precision had become a scavenger horde. They raided abandoned villages, ripping apart barns for flour, digging through cellars for pickled vegetables or vodka. Sometimes they traded with locals. More often they took by force. The rules of occupation blurred into survival. Even officers turned a blind eye. As one lieutenant recorded, "A man with no food has no morals." Rats thrived. Fat, fearless, almost friendly. They ran through trenches, gorging on crumbs and corpses alike. Men trapped in blockaded positions caught them with wire snares and roasted them over shell casings. The smell of burning fur became the smell of dinner. Some units nicknamed the rats Russians. Others, comrades. Dark humor was cheaper than meat. Water was worse. Snow had to be melted for every sip. But snow stole heat from the body faster than the fire could return it. Soldiers mixed it with antifreeze, alcohol, or even gasoline to keep it from refreezing, then drank it anyway. Their lips split, their tongues cracked, their stomachs burned. Still, thirst was stronger than reason. The few supply convoys that did arrive brought tragedy disguised as tins. Labels were gone, ink washed away. You never knew if the can held beans or rot. Sometimes it was edible. Sometimes it hissed, bloated with gas, and the stench of death poured out like smoke. Yet men still scraped the inside clean with spoons, licking the metal as if it might remember flavor. By 1942, the hunger wasn't just physical. It was spiritual. They dreamed of food the way the dying dream of air. One veteran later recalled, "In the East we stopped talking about home, women, or God. We only talked about soup." Another said the worst sound was not artillery, but someone eating quietly when you had nothing left. Command tried to maintain order. Rations were cut, then cut again. Propaganda told them they were hardening the will of the Aryan. But the will doesn't boil down like bone broth. Men fainted on marches, hands trembling too much to fire rifles. Some froze with bread in their pockets, too exhausted to chew. In a single winter campaign, the German army lost more soldiers to hunger and cold than to bullets. Desperation bred invention and madness. Tin helmets became frying pans. Gasoline warmed coffee made from crushed acorns. Soup was thickened with snow to fool the eye into believing there was more of it. A single cube of sugar could start a fist fight, a tin of meat, a mutiny. In one recorded incident near Vyazma, 2 squads traded a captured chicken for a functioning rifle. The rifle jammed. The chicken fed 12 men. Guess which they remembered? And through it all, the enemy was eating too. On the other side of the frozen river, Soviet soldiers boiled cabbage in helmets and gnawed black bread. But at least they were home. They could imagine mothers, farms, warmth. The Germans could only imagine escape. They began to fear the smell of their own kitchens. It meant the Russians had surrounded them. By the winter of 1943, the Eastern Front had become a graveyard of bellies. At Stalingrad, rations dropped to 200 grams of bread per day. That bread was half sawdust. Men scraped wallpaper for paste, chewed belts, boiled leather gloves. When horses died, they were celebrated like victories. When the horses were gone, the silence after hunger became unbearable. Even officers broke. One captain wrote in his diary, "Today I ordered a man shot for stealing bread. Then I ate the bread." Another, "The snow is clean. It tastes like surrender." There were rumors, always whispered, never proven, of cannibalism in isolated pockets. Men who vanished at night and reappeared fed the next morning. No one asked questions. The Eastern Front was beyond judgment. It was where humanity froze solid and cracked apart. And yet, in the middle of that desolation, small kindnesses still flickered. A soldier sharing his last biscuit. A cook melting snow for someone else's coffee. A laugh that lasted one spoonful longer than despair. Tiny rebellions against the starvation that ruled them. When spring finally came, it brought mud instead of mercy. The snow melted, revealing what hunger had buried, bodies still clutching empty tins. The smell of thaw was unbearable. It wasn't victory or defeat anymore. It was rot. The German army that had marched east with bread and pride now limped west with nothing but bones and memory. So imagine it. A frozen trench outside Kharkov, dawn barely touching the horizon. A soldier unwraps his last crust of bread. He doesn't pray. He doesn't speak. He just eats, slowly, quietly, as the ice crackles around him. Somewhere behind him, the empire he fights for is already starving to death. And he just wants to taste something that isn't snow. If hunger had a capital, it was the Eastern Front. And if survival had a flavor for the Red Army, it was cabbage. Boiled, pickled, fermented, fried, sometimes even imagined, cabbage was the Soviet answer to despair. It filled the pots, the trenches, and eventually the dreams of men who had nothing else left to believe in. The Soviet soldier was not promised comfort. He was promised endurance. From the first days of the war, supply lines buckled under chaos. Factories were dismantled and hauled east, farms burned, railroads bombed. The commissars talked of ideology, the soldiers talked of soup. Every regiment received official rations: black bread, buckwheat porridge, a slice of dried fish, and cabbage in some form. Meat was a rumor, sugar a fantasy. Tea, if you could call it that, was boiled snow with a twig for color. Yet somehow they fought on. Starved, frostbitten, half asleep, they dragged themselves through the ruins of cities and fields, powered by something that no kitchen could supply. One Soviet veteran would later say, "We were not fighting on food. We were fighting on revenge." In the trenches around Moscow and Leningrad, food arrived when the artillery didn't drown it first. Cooks ladled out soup so thin it reflected the moon. Still, men lined up with mess tins, guarding every drop as if it were gold. When there was no cabbage, they used nettles, weeds, even sawdust boiled with salt. They called it frontline borscht. No one laughed. No one complained. To complain was bourgeois. To eat, even badly, was patriotic. Bread was the treasure of the Soviet world. Black, coarse, heavy as stone, made of rye, barley, or whatever could be ground that week. Each loaf was divided by weight: 600 grams for frontline soldiers, 300 for civilians, 125 for the besieged of Leningrad. At 125 grams a day, people learned to make a slice last an hour, sucking it, not chewing, letting the taste linger like a prayer. One crumb on the snow could start a riot. One crust shared could forge a friendship that outlived the war. And still, even amid famine, ritual mattered. Before battle, soldiers dipped bread in salt if they had any, a peasant gesture of blessing. After battle, if they were lucky, they poured vodka over the same bread in memory of the dead. Food was never just food, it was ceremony. It was proof that life continued despite everything that said it shouldn't. Field kitchens, when they functioned, became the heart of every unit. They were smoke-stained sanctuaries where men thawed their hands over boiling pots. The cooks, often old peasants or wounded veterans, were treated like saints. They decided who got seconds, who got a scrap of fat, who might live another day. They stirred hope into water and called it stew. Sometimes they added truth instead of spice. Eat fast, boys. Tomorrow we march again. The Soviets didn't invent scarcity, but they perfected survival. When rations failed, they foraged. Men dug frozen potatoes from abandoned fields, shot stray dogs, trapped birds. If they found a cow, it was celebrated like a captured tank. If they found vodka, it was victory. They traded tobacco for bread, socks for sugar, bullets for lard. Everything had value. Everything could be eaten or exchanged for something that could be. Behind the lines, Soviet women fought their own war in kitchens and factories. They baked ration bread out of pea flour, tree bark, and cellulose. They boiled weeds to stretch soups. They sewed empty flour sacks into bandages. They didn't ask what went into the meat grinder, only that it produced calories. For them, feeding soldiers wasn't just duty, it was defiance. If the men were the guns of the motherland, the women were its stomach. Propaganda posters told them they were heroes. A smiling mother served a steaming bowl to a soldier with the caption, "Feed him victory." In reality, the bowl was half empty, and the smile was drawn by an artist who hadn't eaten that week. But symbols mattered. Hope needed dressing up too. Then came the sieges: Leningrad, Sevastopol, Stalingrad, each a slow crucifixion of hunger. In Leningrad, people boiled wallpaper for the starch, pets for protein, leather for anything chewable. Soup was made from sawdust mixed with glue. And yet the city held. Musicians played. Bakers baked bread that wasn't really bread. Somehow life insisted on itself. Every bowl of cabbage soup was a declaration: we are not dead yet. At Stalingrad, meals were whatever could be found amid rubble. Horse meat scraped from carcasses, beans from shattered warehouses, grain stolen from rats. Soldiers joked that the rats were the real victors of the Eastern Front. They were fat, fearless, and always ate first. Still, the Soviets kept fighting. The Germans had machines, the Russians had stomachs of iron. And then a strange thing happened. Hunger began to harden into identity. They started to see endurance as proof of superiority. The more they suffered, the more righteous they felt. A soldier wrote, "The Germans have butter. We have will." And somehow will was enough. By 1943, the Red Army was moving west, still starving, still freezing, but now fueled by vengeance and momentum. They sang as they marched, not about food but about home. When they finally reached captured German supply depots, they found sausage, chocolate, real bread. Some ate until they vomited. Others wept. A few simply stared at the food in disbelief, afraid it might disappear if they touched it. For 4 years, the Soviet soldier had fought a war on an empty stomach, and won. Not through abundance, but through endurance. Through cabbage, courage, and a kind of stubborn hunger that no ration could fill. So imagine it. A frozen dawn outside Kursk. A soldier squats beside a dented pot, stirring soup that barely deserves the name. Steam rises, the air smells of salt, smoke, and survival. He lifts the spoon, tastes it, and nods once. "It's enough," he says. And somehow it is. By 1943, the Red Army no longer waited for supply trucks. They waited for luck. Because on the front, luck was a kind of food, invisible, unpredictable, and gone before you could taste it. When the official rations dried up, soldiers didn't starve quietly. They adapted. Loudly. The Soviet front became a laboratory of hunger, where men learned to cook with frost, dirt, and sheer imagination. They called it samostoyatelno snabzany, self-supply. A polite military term for foraging, scavenging, or theft, depending on who was asking. Commanders turned a blind eye. The army that had learned to build tanks out of scrap metal now learned to make dinner out of disaster. Everything edible was fair game. Everything inedible was negotiable. In the forests outside Smolensk, soldiers gathered mushrooms, or things that looked like mushrooms. They boiled them 3 times just in case. Sometimes they still died. In Ukraine, units dug up frozen beets from abandoned fields, washed them with snow, and roasted them on bayonets. When grain was found in bombed silos, they ground it with rifle butts, mixed it with water, and baked it on hot shovels. The result was flat, black bread, part flour, part metal dust, part miracle. Then there were the truly creative ones. Men who could make soup out of anything. Boiled grass with a spoon of lard. Tree bark steeped in salt water. Fish heads scavenged from rivers, bones and all. One soldier in the Caucasus claimed he made stew out of a horse's saddle. Another swore he cooked a boot until it was soft enough to chew. They weren't exaggerating. In the Soviet frontline kitchen, the line between meal and memory disappeared. Barter was a second battlefield. A cigarette could buy you a slice of bread. A pair of dry socks, a handful of sugar. A watch, real or stolen, could fetch a jar of pickles. Food was the only real currency. Everything else, medals, rank, ideology, was decoration. If you had bread, you were rich. If you had soup, you had power. If you had both, you were a king. And yet, even in starvation, there were rules. You didn't steal from your comrade's tin. You didn't eat before the wounded were fed. And if someone died beside you, you divided his rations evenly. Because to eat alone was to admit defeat. The Red Army had few luxuries left, but solidarity was one of them. Shared hunger was its own kind of weapon. Field kitchens, when they could move, followed behind the infantry like wounded beasts. They were little more than scorched pots on sleds pulled by half-dead horses. Still, when the smoke rose, it gave men hope. The smell of boiled anything meant someone, somewhere, was alive enough to cook. When the cooks called kasha, the men would limp toward the voice, bowls out, eyes hollow. It didn't matter what was inside. It mattered that something was. Every soldier had a story about the best meal of the war, and it was never about taste. A potato found under the snow. A crust shared on Christmas Eve. A can of stolen meat devoured behind a tank. They remembered each as if it were a feast. One veteran later said, "When you are starving, even the idea of food feeds you. The mind eats first." But hunger also broke the rules of civilization. There were dark stories, whispered, denied, but never forgotten. Villages stripped bare, livestock slaughtered to the bone, granaries looted by men wearing red stars. In some besieged areas, soldiers traded ammunition for food from peasants, then took the food back by force. Survival blurred into cruelty. The same hunger that united them also corrupted them. War doesn't just destroy bodies. It starves morals too. Still, the ingenuity was astonishing. Cooks improvised with anything. Empty shell casings for soup pots, helmets for pans, bayonets for skewers. Some even used gunpowder to ignite wet firewood, a dangerous trick but better than cold stew. Food tasted of smoke, metal, and desperation, but it was food, and that meant tomorrow existed. Occasionally, supplies did arrive, crates of tinned beef, bread, or American Lend-Lease rations. Those were miracles in boxes. The men tore them open like treasure chests, laughing and crying all at once. Inside were biscuits, cocoa powder, even spam, a foreign word that quickly became sacred. To the Soviets, it tasted like victory, or maybe like someone far away still cared if they lived. They called it second front food, a gift from a world not entirely consumed by fire. But these deliveries were rare, and the hunger always returned. So they learned to trick it. They sang songs before meals to stretch the time. They boiled water long after the ingredients were gone, pretending the flavor was still there. They carved fake bread out of wood to keep their hands busy and their minds from breaking. A soldier once told a journalist decades later, "You learn to stop fearing hunger. You start talking to it. You say, 'Not today.'" When victory finally came, it wasn't triumph that filled them, it was food. They ate like men reborn, tearing into loaves, meat, butter, sugar. Some wept. Some fell sick. Some simply stared, too stunned to believe it was over. But for months afterward, many still pocketed crumbs, still hid food under pillows, still dreamed of cabbage. The stomach never forgets what the soul endured. The art of eating the impossible had become part of them. They had boiled hunger until it surrendered. And when the guns finally fell silent, they carried that knowledge home, not as shame but as proof that a man can live on less than nothing and still win. So imagine it. A ruined village somewhere west of Stalingrad. A soldier sits by a dying fire, holding a dented spoon. He stirs what might once have been soup. Around him, the world is rubble, but in the pot, something steams. He tastes it, swallows, and smiles. It isn't good. It isn't enough. But it's victory, one spoonful at a time. The British Empire didn't march on bread or bullets. It marched on tea. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, the khaki-clad heart of the empire kept beating to the rhythm of the kettle. If you wanted to find a British soldier on the front lines, you didn't listen for gunfire. You listened for the whistle of boiling water. It's said that no army has ever been so obsessed with hot drinks. And maybe that's true. Because for the British Tommy, tea wasn't luxury, it was identity. It was order amid collapse, civilization in a tin cup. When the bombs fell on London, when the tanks broke down in the Libyan sand, when the mail stopped coming and the world seemed to crack apart, the first response was always the same: let's put the kettle on. Officially, the British ration system was one of the most disciplined in the world. Each soldier was issued tinned meat, hard biscuits, a little sugar, a pinch of salt, a smear of jam, and always tea. The supply list treated it as sacred. Lose your rifle, get a reprimand. Lose your tea, and you'd better start digging your own grave. Even Churchill understood. He once said, "Tea is more important to the war effort than ammunition." And he meant it. Tea breaks weren't scheduled. They were instinctive, happening in trenches, bomb craters, even during air raids. A mess tin, a handful of twigs, and a small flame were all it took to restore the illusion of peace. Men joked that the British could brew tea on a tank turret under enemy fire. Sometimes they actually did. But it wasn't just tea. The British soldiers' diet was a curious mix of monotony and miracle. Tinned corned beef known as bully beef, hardtack biscuits that could double as shrapnel, and the occasional ration of plum pudding at Christmas. It was dull, heavy, and beige, the color of duty. Yet there was comfort in that sameness. If it tasted familiar, it meant you were still alive. Tins were the Empire's secret weapon. They resisted rot, weather, and despair. When you opened one, it hissed like reassurance. Inside might be meat, soup, or something pretending to be both. The label didn't matter. The tin was trust. Soldiers carried them across continents, dented, rusted, but never discarded. In a world burning itself to pieces, the British tin was indestructible. It didn't complain. It didn't expire. It endured. When supplies ran short, improvisation filled the gap. In the North African campaign, soldiers mixed condensed milk with water to make a kind of ersatz cream for their tea. They called it desert luxury. In Burma, they learned to cook rice with captured Japanese pots, flavoring it with tinned sardines and courage. And in the bombed streets of London, families shared rations by candlelight, trading sugar stamps like currency. Dig for Victory wasn't just propaganda, it was survival. Front gardens turned into potato fields. Children grew carrots in window boxes. Even in hunger there was order. The secret weapon of morale wasn't courage or command. It was ritual. Every soldier knew it. The British Army might retreat, might even lose, but it would never skip tea. In that small act of boiling water and waiting for leaves to steep, there was control. A brief illusion that the world could still be measured in minutes instead of explosions. If the Germans had Blitzkrieg, the British had Blitzbrew. One sergeant in Tobruk wrote home, "The desert takes everything. The sand eats our food, our engines, our skin. But it can't touch the taste of hot tea. That belongs to us." In the trenches of Italy, men built tiny stoves out of spent shell casings. They brewed tea from rainwater and snow, straining it through socks when filters ran out. It didn't matter how it looked. It mattered that it was warm. Because warmth was hope and hope was rationed. Back home, rationing reshaped daily life. Each citizen received a booklet, pages of coupons for sugar, meat, butter, clothing. There were no exceptions, no shortcuts. Even the royal family followed the rules, at least in public. The queues stretched for blocks, but people waited in silence, holding dignity like a weapon. That calm, the calm of cups clinking in blackout darkness, became the essence of British wartime identity. And yes, there were jokes. Always jokes. Beans again? Spam again? Ah well, better than the Luftwaffe. Humor was another kind of ration, one that never ran out. It flavored everything from the dullest meal to the darkest night. Laughter, like tea, could survive anything. There were brief miracles, of course. A Christmas parcel from home. A slice of real bread. A bit of marmalade saved from 1939. For one moment, the taste of peace returned. Then it was gone, swallowed by duty. But those moments mattered more than medals. Because the war wasn't fought just on land or sea. It was fought in the stomach, in the spirit, in the stubborn British refusal to let despair boil over. When victory finally came in 1945, the kettles boiled harder than ever. Street parties broke out across London, not with champagne but with mugs of tea and tinned cakes. Children waved flags. Women cried. Men raised cups to the sky. And the nation that had been half-starved for 6 years celebrated with the only luxury it had ever truly trusted. Something hot, simple, and shared. Because in the end, it wasn't the planes, the tanks, or the empire that defined them. It was the ritual of survival poured one mug at a time. Tea was the last defense of a weary island, the taste of endurance disguised as comfort. So imagine it. A soldier sitting on a crate in a smoking field. The air still smells of cordite and wet earth. He pours water from his canteen into a dented tin cup, drops in a single tea leaf and waits. The steam rises slowly. He takes a sip. Somewhere in that bitter warmth, he feels the whole country exhale. For the first time in years, the tea doesn't taste like war. It tastes like home. The Second World War was not only fought in trenches or skies. It was fought behind curtains drawn tight against the blackout, in kitchens no larger than closets, where women stirred pots of courage with spoons of scarcity. Britain's most secret weapon wasn't the Spitfire or the Enigma code. It was the housewife with a ration book. When rationing began in 1940, it was supposed to last a few months. It lasted 14 years. Sugar, meat, butter, eggs, tea, clothing, all rationed by weight, coupon, and patience. The book became a second identity, stamped and initialed, carried like a passport through wartime life. Without it, you didn't just lose food. You lost legitimacy. Each page was a contract between nation and citizen. You sacrifice and we survive. The Ministry of Food knew that morale depended on the dinner table. So they launched an army of their own, dietitians, radio hosts, and civil service cooks, who turned thrift into patriotism. Pamphlets urged, waste nothing, grow your own, eat less meat. The nation obeyed, partly from duty, partly because there was simply nothing left to waste. The Dig for Victory campaign transformed the landscape. Backyards, schoolyards, even palace lawns sprouted carrots and cabbage. Every patch of soil became a battlefield against hunger. Children learned to weed before they could read. Neighbors compared compost like officers compared medals. The smell of earth replaced the smell of roast beef. It was the scent of survival. Inside, kitchens adapted. Gas was scarce, Ovens unreliable, ingredients unpredictable. Cooks replaced recipes with resourcefulness. Powdered eggs instead of fresh. Mashed turnip for pudding, mock goose made from lentils and sage. Nothing truly resembled what it imitated, but imagination filled the gaps. The national loaf, gray, coarse, and universally despised, replaced white bread. People called it Hitler's revenge. Still they ate it. They toasted it. They built sandwiches of determination. Every ingredient came with memory. A spoonful of sugar became an event. A pat of butter, a birthday gift. Jam jars were reused until their labels faded into fingerprints. Families stretched stews for a week by adding barley, cabbage, and hope. Even the bones had a second life, boiled for broth, then crushed for garden fertilizer. Nothing died without purpose. Yet for all its hardship, rationing carried a strange democracy. For the first time in British history, the rich and the poor ate almost the same. No black markets for the duke that the dock worker couldn't reach, at least not officially. Everyone queued together, side by side, wrapped in coats and quiet endurance. In those lines, class blurred. War had leveled more than buildings, it had leveled appetites. Communal canteens appeared in bombed-out neighborhoods. They were called British restaurants, though no one confused them with fine dining. For a few pennies you could buy a full meal, stew, pudding, and a cup of tea, cooked by volunteers and served under portraits of the king. The food was plain, the lighting dim, but the atmosphere electric with solidarity. People shared tables, stories, and second helpings of courage. It wasn't glamorous. It was unity in a bowl. Radio programs like the Kitchen Front broadcast daily advice. How to make carrot marmalade, how to disguise powdered milk, how to bake without eggs. Listeners scribbled recipes in notebooks already patched with tape and grease. The host, cheerful even during air raids, ended each episode the same way. Keep smiling and keep stirring. It worked. Smiling became seasoning. Children born during the Blitz learned that sweets were mythical creatures. Each child received 1 ounce of candy a week, 8 to 10 pieces if you were lucky. When ships finally brought chocolate again in 1945, the queues stretched for blocks. Some cried when they tasted it. Some didn't remember how. Even the pets felt the pinch. Meat scraps vanished, so families fed cats porridge and dogs boiled carrots. Pigeons in Trafalgar Square grew bolder. Squirrels disappeared from parks. The ecosystem of hunger was total. Still, there were moments of grace. At Christmas, communities pooled coupons for shared feasts. The smell of nut roast and gravy drifted through bombed-out streets. Candles flickered in milk bottles. Someone played the piano. Someone laughed too loud. For a few hours, it felt like peacetime again. Rationing reshaped not only diets but ideals. People discovered nutrition as strategy. Vitamins became as patriotic as victory. The government promoted national health meals that favored vegetables over meat. Post-war studies showed that despite shortages, Britain had never been healthier. War had forced balance onto the plate. And when peace finally arrived, the end of rationing didn't bring indulgence right away. Habits lingered. People still saved scraps, still queued neatly, still said, "Waste not." Rationing had taught an entire generation that civilization isn't built on abundance. It's built on restraint, on the quiet heroism of making do. Imagine it now. A woman in an apron patched with thread and flour, standing in a dim kitchen. Outside, the sirens are silent for once. She ladles out stew into chipped bowls. One for her husband, one for the neighbor whose house is gone, one for herself. The broth is thin, the bread is gray, but everyone eats in silence. The moment feels holy, because in this small act, feeding others when you barely can feed yourself, the war is already being won. If Britain fought hunger with ration books, America fought it with abundance, organized, industrial, unstoppable abundance. Factories that once built cars now filled cans. Conveyor belts replaced dinner tables. Every lunchbox in Detroit, every field in Kansas, every kitchen in Iowa became part of the same vast machine. Because while the world starved, America cooked. When the war began, the U.S. was still clawing out of the Great Depression. But within months, the arsenal of democracy shifted gears, and the nation that had once rationed dreams began exporting calories. By 1943, American farms and factories were feeding not just their own troops, but their allies, Britain, China, the Soviet Union, and dozens more. Food became diplomacy. Each can of Spam, each crate of wheat, each barrel of coffee was a promise. we've got you. The symbol of that promise was a tin, squat, pink, and miraculous, Spam. Hormel's canned pork shoulder, cheap and shelf-stable, became a global phenomenon. To GIs, it was sustenance. To civilians overseas, it was salvation. It could be fried, boiled, baked, or eaten cold. It could survive months in the Pacific heat or the Arctic cold. Jokes spread faster than ration cards. Spam for breakfast, Spam for lunch, Spam for victory. Yet behind the laughter was gratitude. It filled stomachs when nothing else could. Coffee was the other cornerstone. In every American outpost, from Guadalcanal to Normandy, the day began with the same ritual. A tin cup, a packet of instant grounds, hot water from whatever could boil. The smell of coffee meant life. It was warmth, energy, and memory condensed into steam. Letters from home often included small tins of beans, wrapped carefully in socks. For some soldiers, the scent of coffee was the closest thing left to safety. But the miracle of the American war kitchen wasn't just what it produced, it was how. The entire food system became a logistical symphony. Ships departed daily from New York and San Francisco, stacked high with crates marked U.S. Army ration and Lend-Lease. Each convoy was a floating pantry guarded by destroyers, hunted by U-boats. Every can that reached Europe was a victory, every crate a defiance of the ocean's hunger. The home front ran on efficiency. Every family learned new rules: meatless Tuesdays, wheatless Wednesdays, sugarless Sundays. Victory gardens spread across suburbs, yielding tomatoes and pride. Women rolled up sleeves, joined factory lines, and baked with corn syrup instead of sugar. Cookbooks preached thrift as patriotism. Posters declared, "Food fights for freedom." It wasn't just a slogan. It was strategy. Children collected tin foil and bacon grease for the war effort. Farmers doubled harvests despite shortages of men and fuel. Teenagers drove tractors while their fathers flew bombers. And still the cafeterias filled. No one went hungry, but no one wasted either. Waste was treason. Military rations became masterpieces of packaging and planning. The sea ration, a boxed meal for the field, contained everything from canned stew to powdered lemonade, biscuits, and cigarettes. It was monotonous, but it worked. Each meal delivered 3,700 calories of democracy. Even the chocolate bar became weaponized, high-calorie, heat-resistant, and designed to taste slightly worse than normal chocolate, so soldiers wouldn't eat it too quickly. America's genius wasn't flavor. It was foresight. Still, not everything was plentiful. Sugar, coffee, and canned goods were rationed domestically, and lines formed even in cities untouched by bombs. Yet the mood was different from Europe's. Rationing wasn't endured with grim silence, it was embraced with swagger. Doing without felt like another kind of victory. Posters showed smiling mothers saying, "My boy's at the front, my meat's on points." Sacrifice had become fashion. Hollywood joined the campaign. Stars like Rita Hayworth and Clark Gable appeared in shorts teaching families to confruit and save grease. Radio hosts turned thrift into entertainment. Even Bugs Bunny pitched carrots for victory. In every frame, food was freedom, not just to eat but to share. Overseas, American abundance became legend. British soldiers swapped their gray bread for GI biscuits and wondered if heaven tasted like peanut butter. Russians joked that the US had dropped more Spam than bombs. In France, GIs handed out chocolate bars to children who hadn't seen sugar in years. Those bars did more for diplomacy than any speech. They tasted like liberation. But there was irony too. Behind the plenty lay inequity. Black American soldiers who served in segregated units often received worse rations and fewer supplies. In mess halls, separate but equal still meant hungry. They fought for freedom abroad while rationed on dignity at home. Still, many of them shared what they had, proving that generosity survives even where justice doesn't. By 1945, American food had crossed oceans, cultures, and ideologies. The war ended, but the shipments didn't stop. Food became the foundation of peace, through the Marshall Plan, care packages, and global aid. A can of Spam in Warsaw, a bag of flour in Berlin, a tin of milk in Tokyo. These were the first taste of recovery. The empire of appetite had become the architecture of hope. Back home, the post-war boom exploded into Technicolor abundance. Supermarkets replaced ration lines. Tupperware parties replaced air raid drills. Cooking shows replaced survival guides. And yet, hidden in every kitchen drawer, among the recipes and can openers, was a memory. of the time when food wasn't just comfort but courage. So picture it. A convoy ship somewhere in the Atlantic, 1943. Rain slaps the deck. A sailor holds a steaming mug of coffee, staring into the dark horizon. Below deck, crates of rations rattle: spam, beans, flour, sugar. Each one labeled for allies. He takes a sip, exhales, and mutters, "We're feeding the world." And for once, it isn't arrogance. It's true. The first thing you notice in a foxhole isn't the mud. It's the smell. Wet canvas, gunpowder, sweat. And somewhere in between, the unmistakable, almost holy scent of coffee. It's faint, bitter, and burned. But to an American soldier, it smells like civilization trying to survive the apocalypse. In every army unit, there was one truth. If you could make coffee, you could make morale. No sermon, no pep talk, no patriotic slogan could compete with that first sip at dawn. You could hear the tin cups clinking long before the sun came up. A corporal once said, "If you've got coffee, you've still got the United States." And he was right. The army issued packets of instant coffee in every C-ration box. A miracle of powdered comfort that dissolved in water, hot or cold. Men mixed it in helmets, canteens, even cartridge boxes. Sometimes they brewed it with water so muddy it came out the color of despair. Still they drank it, because when the ground shook and the sky fell, coffee was proof that time hadn't stopped. Morning rituals in the foxhole followed no official manual. You woke up, if you'd slept at all, scraped mud off your face, checked your rifle, and reached for your matches. There was always a risk. A flame could give away your position. But soldiers lit up anyway, shielding the spark with their hands, praying the enemy wouldn't see. For those few seconds, they weren't soldiers. They were just people trying to feel human again. The sound of boiling water in a helmet was a lullaby for the damned. Steam rose like ghosts of home. Kitchens in Ohio, porches in Georgia, diners in New York. The coffee itself was awful. Metallic, acrid, half made of mud. But that didn't matter. It was ritual. It was identity. And sometimes, it was the only warm thing they touched all day. Food in the field was another story. The C-rations were practical, filling, and famously depressing. A can of hash, a biscuit, a chocolate bar designed to taste just bad enough not to be eaten all at once. Sometimes beans. Sometimes mystery meat. Always salt. Lots of salt. Enough to remind you that your tongue still worked. Every soldier had his favorites. The meat and beans was reliable. Chopped ham and eggs was cursed. But the holy grail, the one everyone traded for, was beef stew. Thick, greasy, and full of unidentifiable chunks, it tasted like something your mother might have made if your mother was the US Army. The stew was currency. Men would swap cigarettes, soap, or even a spare bullet for it. You could tell how the battle was going by what they were willing to trade. And yet, food wasn't just survival. It was time travel. Every bite was a bridge to before the uniforms, before the fear, before the mud. A spoonful of stew could conjure a kitchen in Chicago or a diner in Kansas City. The taste of sugar was a memory of peace. The smell of coffee, a whisper of home. In the still moments between shell fire, soldiers would share their rations, telling stories as they ate, stories of girls, cars, bar fights, and places that now felt like fairy tales. One would say, "When I get home, I'm never eating beans again." Another would answer, "When I get home, I'm never letting my coffee get cold." Both lies, of course. They'd eat beans again. They'd let coffee go cold. But the act of saying it, that was hope disguised as small talk. Mail call was a feast of its own. Letters from home were read like recipes. Mama's making apple pie every Sunday, one might say. My wife says she canned peaches this summer. Even the lies were delicious. They fed the spirit when the stomach had stopped caring. Sometimes generosity became rebellion. Soldiers would share extra rations with local kids, slipping chocolate bars through barbed wire. They'd trade spam for eggs with farmers, cigarettes for bread, whiskey for forgiveness. In occupied Europe, food became diplomacy. A can of beans said more than any treaty ever could. And in that strange way, the American soldier, armed, dirty, exhausted, became an ambassador of appetite. Night was the hardest. No fires, no noise, no movement. You sat in darkness, listening to insects and distant engines, your hands wrapped around a tin cup for warmth that never came. That's when the loneliness crept in, slow, quiet, inevitable. Some men prayed. Some wrote letters. Most just sipped coffee and waited for the sun. By 1944, the the American Army had developed a new tradition, the Foxhole Cafe. A joke, of course. No walls, no tables, just two soldiers sitting in the mud with tin cups, pretending they were in a diner somewhere back home. They gave themselves waiter names: Eddie's Grill, Lou's Lunch Counter. One would say, "What'll it be today, sir?" The other would grin and answer, "Coffee. Black. And keep the shells off my toast." Then the laughter would echo through the night, soft as smoke. That's what kept them going. Not the food itself, but the ritual, the stubborn insistence on normalcy in a place where nothing was normal. Every spoonful of stew, every sip of coffee was defiance. A way of saying we're still here. We still eat. We still live. When the war finally ended, the soldiers went home with new habits. They couldn't sleep without coffee by their bedside. They salted everything too much. They saved empty cans, unable to throw away metal that had once meant survival. And sometimes, when they drank that first cup in peace, they'd close their eyes and see the foxhole, the mud, the steam, the faces of men who didn't make it back. The coffee tasted different then. Stronger, sadder, more sacred. So picture it. A gray dawn in Normandy, 1944. A soldier crouches in a shallow hole, his helmet dented, his boots soaked. He lights a match, just long enough to heat a cup of coffee. The flame flickers, defiant. He takes a sip. For one heartbeat, the world feels normal again. And that's enough to keep him alive. The war in the Pacific didn't smell like gunpowder. It smelled like rot. Salt, sweat, mildew, the stench of everything too wet to burn and too alive to die. Here, food didn't just feed you, it betrayed you. Cans swelled and burst in the heat. Bread turned to mold before sunrise. Chocolate melted into paste. Only the insects thrived. They feasted on everything: flesh, fabric, and fear. To fight in the Pacific was to fight hunger itself. The islands were paradise turned prison. Jungles so thick you could lose your platoon 10 feet away, rivers crawling with leeches, beaches littered with wrecks. And through it all, the soldiers of the US and Allied forces carried the same burden. The sea ration box, 12 ounces of hope wrapped in tin. Each box promised stability. It lied. In the tropics, cans rusted within days. The meat inside turned green. Open one wrong and the smell could make a grown man gag. Spam became both savior and curse. They called it meat that dies twice. It was fried, boiled, buried, and resurrected, until even the word made stomachs twist. Still, it filled the void. You could hate spam all you wanted, but you'd still eat it when the jungle closed in. Water was the real luxury. Every drop had to be boiled, filtered, or blessed by chance. Men drank rain from helmets, condensation from tent flaps, and sometimes from shell holes filled with rainwater and ash. Malaria pills came daily, bitter as betrayal. The heat never relented. You didn't sweat it out, it replaced your blood. By noon, shirts clung to skin like rags soaked in glue. By night, the mosquitoes found every inch you forgot to cover. Cooking was improvisation under siege. They built stoves from shell casings, cooked rice in helmets, and used rifle barrels to stir soup. You could tell a veteran not by his medals, but by the burn marks on his mess kit. The jungle didn't forgive mistakes, not in navigation, not in appetite. If you picked the wrong fruit, it could kill you faster than a bullet. Still, necessity breeds invention. GIs learned from locals, Filipinos, Australians, Islanders, how to make do. Coconuts became lifesavers, providing water, fat, and flavor. Bananas were roasted, taro steamed, fish grilled over palm leaves. It wasn't comfort food, but it was real food. Every meal scavenged from the island was a small victory, a momentary truce between man and environment. And then there was coffee. Always coffee. Boiled in helmets, stirred with sticks, black as night and twice as bitter. Even in the jungle, the ritual endured. Before every patrol, before every ambush, someone would light a flame under the rain. The cup passed from hand to hand, warm, shaking, sacred. They drank not for taste, but for courage. Because when you're surrounded by shadows, you cling to routine like it's armor. Courage, though, wasn't just found in food. It was forged in the act of sharing it. In the Pacific, everything was communal. The fear, the sweat, the hunger. If one man had an extra can, it belonged to all of them. A single tin of beans could feed 4, a slice of bread 6. No one ate alone. Not because they were noble, because they understood survival was plural. Brotherhood was the only ration that didn't run out. Sometimes, generosity bordered on madness. One Marine on Guadalcanal gave away his last ration to a buddy, saying, "If I die, I won't need it. If you die, I'll just take it back." Both men lived. They laughed about it for the rest of the war. That's how soldiers in the Pacific learned to stay sane, through gallows humor and shared hunger. There were moments when even the impossible felt holy. Like the time rainwater pooled on a tin roof and someone used it to boil coffee for 40 men. Or when a crate of oranges washed ashore after a storm, and the entire platoon sucked the peels dry in silence. The sweetness made them cry. They said it was the best meal of their lives. Maybe it was. The jungle didn't care about glory. It devoured the careless and mocked the brave. Men wasted away on diets of rice and rot, skin peeling, stomachs twisting. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion were constants. You could see the war eating them alive. Yet they still shared their last bites. Not because they believed in the cause, because they believed in each other. Letters home turned into food diaries. One wrote, "Ma, send ketchup if you can. Spam ain't so bad if you can hide the taste." Another, "We talk about hamburgers more than girls now. Guess that's what growing up means." It was dark humor, born from desperation and devotion. When you can laugh about hunger, you've already beaten half of it. The Pacific taught them something Europe couldn't. That survival is less about what you eat and more about who you eat with. The jungle stripped everything away, comfort, routine, even language, but it couldn't strip brotherhood. That was the one thing that never spoiled. When the war ended and they came home, some couldn't touch canned meat again. Some couldn't sleep without the sound of rain on canvas. Some kept a tin of Spam in their pantry for decades, not to eat but to remember, because inside that can wasn't just food, it was proof that they'd endured the impossible together. So imagine it. A clearing in the jungle, 1944. A ring of soldiers sit cross-legged in the mud. One opens a can with his knife, another lights a match in cupped hands. They pass the can around, taking turns, joking softly, pretending it tastes good. Thunder rumbles. Rain falls. They don't stop eating. They don't stop smiling. In that moment, surrounded by death and rot, they are full. Not of food, but of brotherhood. Every army eats, but Imperial Japan tried to turn hunger into holiness. In the Japanese military, food was never simply nourishment. It was morality, hierarchy, and proof of devotion to the emperor. To be hungry was not weakness. It was virtue. A soldier who complained about rations wasn't starving. He was dishonoring his ancestors. Officially, every man in the Imperial Army was supposed to receive rice, pickles, miso, and fish. In practice, he got half that, and sometimes less. Rice, the soul of Japan, became rare the farther the troops moved from home. In China, Burma, New Guinea, the Philippines, the supply lines stretched like veins over poisoned ground. Ships sank, crops failed, convoys vanished into jungles. And so the Japanese soldier learned to live without what defined him. They called it gamen, endurance without complaint. It was the moral engine of the army. Hunger became a badge of discipline, proof that the spirit was stronger than the stomach. An officer might say, "A true warrior eats last, if at all." And the men believed it. They had to, because belief filled the void that rice no longer could. By 1943, starvation had become strategy. Entire divisions marched through jungles with nothing but sacks of millet and prayer. Soldiers boiled grass, bark, even leather belts to survive. When rations disappeared entirely, they hunted snakes, monkeys, and lizards. In New Guinea, men resorted to eating sago palm starch, roots, and sometimes each other's shadow. They joked that even the jungle was losing weight. Letters home, when they came, spoke in code. "The rice is very white here," one wrote, meaning there is no rice. Another said, "We share everything," which meant we have almost nothing. Censorship forbade despair. So the soldiers wrote poetry instead. "Tonight the moon is full, but my bowl is empty." The officers suffered too, but less. Hierarchy controlled even hunger. High-ranking men were fed first and sometimes best. The rank and file called it senpai no gohan, senior rice. If you were low on the ladder, you waited. If you were lowest, you starved. And if you died, your remaining rations went back into the pot, recycled into discipline. The irony was cruel. Japan's military culture worshipped rice. Yet in the field, soldiers survived on imported barley, millet, or whatever they could steal. Rice became myth like home itself, perfect, distant, unreachable. The less they ate it, the more sacred it became. When a rare shipment arrived, men ate in silence, heads bowed. Some wept. One spoonful of white rice could feel like forgiveness. The deeper the war dragged, the more the army embraced hunger as destiny. Posters showed smiling soldiers with empty bowls, slogans reading, "Eat little, win much." Propaganda films celebrated troops marching on air. Behind the camera, men fainted between takes. In the jungles of Burma, entire regiments wasted away before seeing combat. Disease finished what hunger began. Dysentery, beriberi, malaria. The imperial army was dissolving from within, but silence was policy. No soldier wanted to be remembered as the man who asked for seconds. Cooks fought their own desperate battles. They scraped mold from rice, boiled swamp water, mixed flour with sawdust to stretch portions. They roasted insects for protein. One diary from the Philippines describes a recipe called shadow stew. Water, salt, and imagination. The writer ended with, "Tasted fine." He died 2 days later. And yet, the myth of endurance held. Men too weak to walk still bowed to officers. Units starving to death still performed morning drills. They believed hunger purified them, stripped away weakness, fear, and individuality. It did. It stripped away life too. When surrender finally came, Allied troops found skeletons in uniforms still saluting. Some Japanese soldiers, isolated on islands, didn't even know the war had ended. They kept foraging, still cooking roots and snails decades later. For them, the emperor's order to endure had never expired. They had become ghosts of obedience, men who lived on honor and memory alone. Back home, Japan's civilians had shared the suffering. Ration cards were meaningless when there was nothing to ration. People boiled weeds and acorns, ground sweet potatoes into flour, used soy pulp as filler. The phrase, "one grain of rice for every heartbeat," became both prayer and mockery. Mothers lied to children, saying they had already eaten. Children pretended to believe them. The entire nation starved politely. And yet, in that silence, there was a strange beauty. Communal meals in evacuation centers, a single rice ball split 5 ways, neighbors trading pickles for salt. The act of sharing, even nothing, kept them human. One witness recalled, "We had no strength left to speak, but we still said, 'Itadakimasu' before every meal. That word kept us alive." The war ended, but the hunger lingered. 4 years after surrender, Japan's people dreamed of rice the way soldiers once dreamed of home. When the first American relief ships arrived, unloading sacks of white grain onto docks, people wept openly. They lined up in silence, bowls trembling in their hands. When the first mouthful hit their tongues, some laughed, some cried, some simply bowed. The empire of discipline had fallen. The empire of appetite had returned. Imagine it. A jungle clearing in Luzon, 1945. A Japanese private sits alone beside a rusted pot. He empties his canteen into it, adds a handful of rice, his last. The water boils weakly. He stirs with a stick, watches the steam rise. He doesn't know the war is over. He only knows the emperor expects him to endure. He eats slowly, eyes closed, each grain a prayer. Somewhere far across the ocean, peace has begun. But here, in the silence of hunger, he is still fighting, one bite at a time. Mussolini had promised Italians glory, conquest, and full stomachs. What they got was illusion, and eventually hunger. By 1943, the Roman dream had rotted. The empire of marble and rhetoric now stood on cracked plates, empty pots, and the smell of boiled weeds. Italy's war wasn't just lost in the field. It was lost at dinner. The fascist regime called it La Battaglia del Grano, the battle for grain. A decade before the war, Mussolini had ordered farmers to grow more wheat to make Italy self-sufficient. Posters showed him standing in golden fields, jaw clenched, sleeves rolled up, the Duce as farmer king. In reality, the soil was thin, the weather cruel, and the yield never enough. By the time the bombs began to fall, Italy's pantries were already empty. Rationing came early and dignity left early. Each citizen received a tessera annuaria, a ration card printed on paper so thin it felt symbolic. Bread was limited to a few ounces a day. Meat became memory. Olive oil was a rumor. Families stretched flour with chestnut meal, made pasta from barley, fried potato peels, and called it cuisine. Children were taught patriotic songs about sacrifice. They sang with empty stomachs. In the cities, propaganda insisted that everyone was eating well. Newspapers printed recipes for victory stews, cabbage boiled with imagination. The radio assured listeners that scarcity was patriotic, that true Italians needed only faith and Mussolini. But in the markets, women traded jewelry for eggs. In alleys, bakers whispered about secret flour shipments. And in homes, mothers rationed the last spoon of sugar for a child's birthday, pretending it was cake. The black market became the real economy. Men in dark coats sold bread that tasted of ashes. Farmers hid grain from tax collectors and fed partisans in the hills instead. For every kilo of wheat sent to Rome, 10 vanished into the countryside, into bellies, into bribes, into survival. In Naples, children learned to beg from soldiers, calling Allied troops Zio Americano, Uncle American. They traded smiles for chocolate. Sometimes that was all it took to feel human again. The army fared no better. Italian soldiers in North Africa fought under the same sun as the Germans, but with half the food and none of the arrogance. Their rations, a crust of bread, a tin of beans, a few olives, couldn't match the desert. They joked bitterly, "We came for empire and found only sand." When supplies failed, they lived on cactus, dates, and sometimes stolen rations from their German allies. To the Wehrmacht, Italians were weak. To the Italians, the Germans were fat. Both were half right. Back home, the government encouraged people to eat substitute foods. Coffee made from roasted chicory, butter from whipped carrots, meat from soy pulp and herbs. Each imitation tasted like defeat. Still, people smiled for the cameras, stirring their ersatz meals for propaganda reels. A perfect illusion, until the camera stopped rolling and the kitchen fell silent again. By 1943, the war had turned on its creators. Bombs tore through Milan, Florence, and Naples. Markets collapsed. Ration lines stretched for hours, ending in nothing. The fascist slogans on the walls, "Believe, obey, fight," now looked like cruel jokes beside starving crowds. Italy was eating itself. The empire had become a beggar. Then came the armistice. The Duce was gone, the Germans occupied the north, and the Allies landed in the south. Italy was no longer fighting for glory, it was fighting for dinner. In the liberated zones, American rations poured in, tins of Spam, powdered milk, chocolate, and chewing gum. To a starving child, the taste of Hershey's was the taste of freedom. To an old farmer, a can of corned beef was the death of fascism. No speech could compete with that kind of salvation. The people began to eat hope again, slowly, cautiously. Communities pooled what they had. Neighbors cooked together in bombed-out courtyards, stirring soup from scavenged vegetables. Priests blessed the pots as if they were sacraments. Hunger had humbled them all. The pomp of empire was gone, replaced by the quiet holiness of a shared meal. Yet scars remained. A generation grew up afraid of waste. Even decades later, Italians would keep breadcrumbs in jars, reuse oil until it smoked, hoard sugar like memory. The war had rewritten the national appetite. No longer for conquest. For enough. Just enough. Historians later called it the famine of dignity. But to those who lived it, it was simpler. It was a time when food told the truth, when all the lies of politics dissolved in an empty bowl. Because hunger has no ideology. It votes only for survival. Imagine it now. A family in Florence, 1944. The mother sets the table with cracked plates. On each, a small slice of bread. She pours soup made from beans and rainwater, ladles it evenly. Outside, the city burns. Inside, they bow their heads. No one speaks. They eat in silence, not because there's nothing to say, but because they've already said everything that matters. Every spoonful is a confession, a prayer, a promise. And when it's done, the mother collects the bowls and whispers, "Tomorrow we'll have more." It's a lie. But in wartime, hope is just hunger spoken softly. The sound of war in America wasn't artillery. It was the whistle of factory shifts, the clatter of canning lids, the hiss of ration stamps pressed into envelopes. While soldiers ate crations in foxholes, their families fought a quieter war across kitchen tables. Every dinner at home became an act of logistics, patriotism, and restraint. Because in total war, even breakfast was strategy. By 1942, food had become weaponized. The Office of Price Administration issued glossy posters that read, "Do with less so they'll have enough." And Americans listened. Butter, sugar, meat, coffee, rationed. Every household received a booklet of blue and red stamps, each one a tiny declaration of duty. You could have cake or you could have conscience. Most chose conscience, though they never stopped dreaming of cake. Supermarkets turned into moral battlegrounds. Clerks became referees, counting points as carefully as generals counted bullets. A pound of hamburger? 8 red points. A can of peaches? 21 blue. Children learned math through hunger. They watched their parents trade stamps like poker chips, whispering over shelves of empty tins. And yet, no one starved. Not really. America had learned how to share. Victory gardens bloomed everywhere, behind houses, beside schools, on rooftops and vacant lots. Carrots grew next to mailboxes, beans climbed telephone poles. By 1944, these gardens produced nearly 40% of the nation's vegetables. It wasn't just about food, it was proof of self-reliance. The soil became a symbol, each sprouting seed a whisper of control in a world gone mad. Posters showed smiling women in aprons, sunlight on their faces, hose in hand, plant of victory. Reality was mud, sweat, and mosquitoes, but the pride was real. A tomato in August felt like triumph. Cookbooks changed too. Titles like Recipes for Victory, Wartime Meals, and How to Bake Without Sugar. Mothers became chemists, mixing substitutes for memory and desperation. Mashed potatoes replaced cream in cakes. Carrots stood in for sweeteners. Mock apple pie used crackers and syrup instead of fruit, and somehow it worked. Americans discovered that taste could surrender to necessity and still survive. They learned creativity under constraint, the purest kind of invention. Then came the women in factories, the rosies with rolled-up sleeves. Lunch breaks were brief, but meals mattered. Cafeterias served mountains of sandwiches, coffee black as engine oil, and pies that tasted like overtime pay. For many, this was the first time food meant independence. They ate side by side with other women, other colors, other stories, the cafeteria becoming its own quiet revolution. Patriotism was baked into the bread and ladled into the stew. Children collected tin foil and bacon grease for the war effort. Yes, bacon grease. Posters declared, "Save fat for explosives." It sounded absurd until you learned glycerin from cooking fat made bombs. Every kitchen became a miniature arsenal. While fathers fought abroad, mothers armed the homeland with spatulas and jars. Coffee was the great compromise. With imports cut off, Americans stretched every bean. Some roasted chicory, barley, or even ground sweet potatoes. It didn't taste right, but it tasted loyal. When real coffee returned after the war, veterans said the first cup smelled like peace itself. Black markets existed, of course. A few people cheated the system. Counterfeit stamps, back alley steaks, sugar under the table. But even that became folklore, part of the shared mythology of wartime America. Most citizens held the line. It wasn't just fear of law, it was pride. No one wanted to be the reason a soldier went hungry overseas. And through it all, there was propaganda, loud, colorful, relentless. Films showed smiling families eating sensible portions while the narrator promised, "Our boys thank you." Cartoon characters preached thrift. Superman told kids to clean their plates. Even Hollywood joined in. Stars posed with ration cards, proving that glamour could diet too. It was the only time in history when restraint became fashionable. When victory finally came in 1945, America celebrated with food. Sugar returned first. Bakeries reopened with the smell of frosting and forgiveness. Restaurants unveiled forbidden menus: steaks, milkshakes, pies. People lined up not for rations but for joy. They ate like they were reclaiming lost years. But beneath the feasting was memory, the quiet discipline that had carried them through scarcity. Waste still felt sinful. Gratitude became habit. Soldiers coming home noticed it immediately. After years of tin cans and powdered eggs, the taste of real bread, fresh butter, and hot coffee was overwhelming. Some cried at the dinner table. Others couldn't stop eating, as if afraid it might vanish again. Every family feast was a reunion between hunger and abundance. Every bite a reminder they'd earned this. And yet, the lessons of rationing never fully disappeared. Post-war America built its prosperity on the discipline of those years. Canning factories became food corporations. Home gardens became suburbs. And the idea that ordinary citizens could fight global wars with spoons and seeds became part of the national mythology. The home front feast was more than survival, it was transformation. It proved that unity could be baked daily, one loaf at a time. Imagine it. A small kitchen in Ohio, 1945. The war is over. A father just returned from Europe sits at the table. His wife brings him a plate: eggs, toast, butter, coffee. Real coffee. He stares for a long moment, unsure whether to laugh or pray. Then he takes a bite. The flavor is ordinary, but it floods him with something extraordinary: safety. Outside, neighbors cheer. Inside, forks clink softly. Peace, it turns out, tastes like breakfast. When the shooting stopped, the hunger didn't. Europe in 1945 was a graveyard of cities and a famine of kitchens. Fields were cratered, livestock gone, rail lines twisted like ribbons of tin. In France, they said the war ended on paper. In the stomach, it was still going. Bread lines replaced battle lines. For millions, victory didn't taste like freedom. It tasted like boiled weeds and ration soup. Across the continent, governments printed new currencies faster than they could bake bread. In the ruins of Berlin, the black market became the real economy. Cigarettes were worth more than marks, chocolate more than gold. One American Hershey bar could buy a day's labor, a night's shelter, or a stolen kiss. Children chased GIs through the streets shouting, "Chocolade! Chocolade!" It was the first English word they learned. It meant mercy. Liberation had its own flavor. In Paris, cafe doors reopened under tattered tricolors. The first cups of coffee in years steamed like miracles. People wept into their saucers. In Belgium, bakers swept the dust from bombed ovens and started again with whatever flour they could find. Each loaf came out misshapen, uneven, perfect. It wasn't about taste, it was proof that life could rise again. The British kept rationing long after the war. Tea, butter, bacon, all still measured, weighed, counted. Victory didn't erase scarcity, it institutionalized it. Londoners joked that peace was just another kind of discipline. But they also knew something deeper. Survival had made them careful, humble, grateful. Every crumb had meaning now. A cup of tea was still the national prayer. In Germany, surrender came with starvation. Bombing had destroyed 40% of food production. Cities ran on thin soups and despair. People scraped wallpaper for flour paste, boiled grass, roasted beet pulp. Those who remembered the last war said this hunger was worse because it came with guilt. They had lost more than a war, they had lost their moral appetite. When Allied trucks rolled in with food parcels, the sight was almost unbearable. Men too proud to beg still cried when they saw bread again. The American relief effort, the Marshall Plan before the Marshall Plan, turned logistics into salvation. UNRWA trucks crisscrossed the continent, hauling powdered milk, canned meat, dried eggs, and the miracle of chocolate. Each crate bore the words, "Gift of the American people." For many Europeans, it was the first time America was more than a rumor or a uniform. It was the hand that fed them. In villages across Poland, France, and the Netherlands, children stood in line holding tin cups, waiting for the ladle of hot soup that meant they might live another day. But liberation wasn't just foreign trucks and canned goods. It was the return of ritual. Families gathered again around tables, often broken, uneven, missing legs. They lit candles in bottles, passed bread by hand, and ate in silence. Not because there was plenty, but because there was finally peace. The first post-war meal was rarely glamorous. It was bread dipped in soup, potatoes fried in oil from the black market, maybe an onion, maybe not. Yet those meals were feasts, celebrations of the impossible fact that they were still here. In Italy, people sang while cooking again. Old recipes resurfaced like memories. Tomatoes, olive oil, and pasta reclaimed their rightful place on the stove. Even if the sauce was thin, it was sacred. Street vendors returned calling out, "Pane caldo, vino rosso." Warm bread and red wine, simple luxuries that once symbolized life before fascism, now reborn as life after it. In the East, under Soviet occupation, the story was darker. Food became politics. Grain was seized, redistributed, rationed under watchful eyes. In Warsaw and Prague, liberation meant trading one hunger for another. Still, people adapted. In cellars and small apartments, grandmothers stretched flour with mashed potatoes, brewed coffee from roasted barley, and smuggled hope in jars. Because even behind iron curtains, the smell of bread baking could still make someone believe in tomorrow. Everywhere, the first year of peace was a season of contrast. In the same streets where tanks had rolled, markets returned. Women bartered for eggs beside burnt-out buildings. Children sold flowers where soldiers once fought. The soundtrack of Europe shifted from sirens to sizzling oil, from boots to clinking plates. The war had silenced laughter. Now it crept back, softly at first, then louder with every shared meal. Slowly, food became more than survival. It became memory, the language through which people rebuild trust. A loaf shared between neighbors who once fought on opposite sides. A GI invited to Sunday dinner in a French farmhouse. A German woman trading recipes with the wife of the man who liberated her city. The table became Europe's first peace conference. Even the scars turned symbolic. In London, bomb sites became community gardens. In Amsterdam, canal-side warehouses turned into co-ops distributing milk and butter. And in Rome, priests blessed the first harvest of post-war wheat, calling it pain di perdono, bread of forgiveness. The whole continent seemed to understand. Rebuilding meant more than bricks. It meant appetite. Imagine it now, Paris, winter 1946. Snow falls over the city still scarred by occupation. A cafe hums with warmth. Inside, 3 generations crowd around a small table. Grandparents who remember the Great War, parents who survived this one, and a child who has never seen peace before tonight. On the table sits a single roasted chicken, their first in years. They pass it slowly, reverently, like communion. Outside, bells ring. Inside, knives scrape plates, wine is poured, laughter cracks open the silence. After years of noise and hunger, Europe is finally eating again. And for the first time in a decade, the taste of life isn't fear. It's food. When the last bombs fell silent, the world's next great weapon wasn't made of steel. It was made of calories. From the ashes of war, humanity began its strangest transformation. From ration carts to grocery aisles, from survival to surplus. The 20th century's real revolution didn't happen on the battlefield. It happened in the kitchen. The factories that had once built tanks were retooled to build refrigerators. Canneries that filled ration tins now filled supermarket shelves. Scientists who'd invented powdered eggs and dehydrated soup for soldiers turned those same tricks into peacetime miracles. Instant coffee, baby formula, boxed cake mix. The tools of war became the machinery of convenience. For the first time in history, food could travel faster than hunger. In America, the GI Bill built not just houses but habits. Suburbs spread like vines across farmland, each with a grocery store at its heart, a temple of fluorescent abundance. Shelves gleamed with canned peaches, frozen peas, cornflakes, and Spam, the same product that had fed soldiers now rebranded as dinner for peace. Advertisements preached a new gospel, efficiency. A modern housewife, it said, could feed her family faster than ever, and look good doing it. The war had taught people discipline. Peace taught them indulgence. Europe followed, rebuilding through reconstruction and relief. The Marshall Plan didn't just send money, it sent wheat, powdered milk, and industrial know-how. New milling machines, fertilizer plants, and cold storage depots rose beside bombed cathedrals. Where once people hoarded crumbs, now they bought loaves by the dozen. Bread lines became checkout lines. For a continent that had lived on silence, the hum of a refrigerator was the sound of civilization returning. But this abundance had a shadow. Hunger was replaced by appetite, and appetite, unrestrained, became its own empire. The lessons of rationing, thrift, respect, balance, began to fade beneath neon signs and jingles. Children who'd grown up hungry now grew up with options, and soon forgot that choice itself was a luxury bought with ashes. The war had also globalized taste. Soldiers who'd fought overseas brought home cravings for things their mothers had never cooked. Italian pasta, French wine, German beer, Japanese soy sauce. The world had been conquered not just by armies but by flavor. Food became diplomacy, nostalgia, and commerce all at once. By the 1950s, an American diner could eat spaghetti a la Napoli or chop suey without leaving Kansas. In Tokyo, you could buy Coca-Cola. In Rome, you could find Hershey's. In London, you could order a hamburger and call it Progress. War had also transformed farming. What began as necessity became industry. Synthetic fertilizers, developed from wartime chemistry, doubled crop yields. Pesticides like DDT promised perfect harvests. Tractors replaced oxen. The farmer became a factory manager and the earth became a machine. It was efficient, dazzling, and dangerous. The same science that ended famine also began reshaping ecosystems in ways no one yet understood. Canning, freezing, and dehydration, technologies born in barracks, now define daily life. Food could cross oceans without spoiling, could sit for years on shelves. For the first time, humanity had beaten time itself, or so it believed. Supermarkets turned meals into merchandise, nutrition into branding. Aisles filled with boxes and slogans, freshness guaranteed. Few remembered that freshness had once meant survival. In the developing world, the story was different but connected. War had redrawn borders and trade routes. Nations newly independent inherited both famine and hope. American surplus grain flooded Asia and Africa, feeding millions but reshaping local diets. Rice gave way to wheat, millet to corn. The planet's palate was standardizing, one shipment at a time. For the first time, hunger became a political tool. Relief could win hearts, but dependence could shape nations. Even the psychology of eating changed. People who had lived through rationing became compulsive savers. They filled pantries, bought in bulk, froze leftovers just in case. Scarcity had ended, but fear remained. Children of war were taught to clean their plates, because wasting food still felt like a sin against memory. Every dinner table was haunted by ghosts who remembered what it meant to have none. Then came television. Cooking left the kitchen and entered the living room. Julia Child in America, Elizabeth David in Britain, they turned food into culture, pleasure, theater. Recipes became performances. The audience learned not just how to cook, but how to desire. The same nations that once rationed sugar now televised frosting. By the 1960s, hunger in the West was almost unthinkable. The world that had been rebuilt on shared sacrifice now measured success by excess. Milk overflows. Bread molds before it's eaten. Supermarkets throw away more in a week than an entire town consumed during wartime. The rations that once symbolized unity have been replaced by waste that symbolizes isolation. Progress, it seems, is a feast without memory. And yet, in quiet kitchens, the old wisdom survives. An elderly woman in Warsaw still keeps her sugar in jars, wrapped in cloth, safe from air and time. A veteran in Kansas still eats Spam once a week, not for taste but remembrance. A grandmother in Naples still insists on finishing every crust. Because for them, the meal is never just food. It's history made edible. Imagine it now, a supermarket at dusk, fluorescent lights flickering across endless aisles. A little girl stands in front of a wall of cereal boxes, hundreds of choices, thousands of colors. She turns to her grandmother and says, "Which one is yours?" The old woman smiles faintly. "All of them," she says, "and none." Because she remembers when the only choice that mattered was whether there'd be any bread at all. The world had survived hunger, but not without losing something in the process. And in that loss lies the quiet lesson of the age. That abundance is not freedom, unless you remember the taste of going without. When the guns fell silent, the next empire wasn't built on steel or oil. It was built on hunger, and on who could feed it. In the decades after 1945, food became power. The nations that had once fought with weapons now fought with wheat, sugar, and grain ships that crossed oceans like quiet conquerors. The Cold War began not just with nuclear threats, but with lunch. For the United States, abundance became strategy. Where bombs had failed to pacify, bread would persuade. From the Marshall Plan to the Food for Peace program, cargo ships loaded with surplus grain set sail for Europe, Asia, and Africa. Each sack of wheat stamped from the American people carried a double meaning: charity and control. Feed a nation and you could shape its politics. Starve it and you could break its will. The empire of appetite had no borders, only influence. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union built its own food ideology. Collectivized farms, state bakeries, quotas, and endless 5-year plans. Communism promised abundance for all, but delivered queues and gray bread. Posters showed smiling workers with overflowing baskets. Reality showed women waiting in the cold for potatoes. Still, food remained the heart of Soviet propaganda, the dream of a table where everyone ate equally, even if that table rarely existed. In Asia, hunger became revolution. In China, the Great Leap Forward tried to feed 1 billion people with ideology instead of infrastructure. Fields were reorganized, crops overplanted, data falsified. When nature rebelled, famine followed, the worst in modern history. Tens of millions perished, and the world saw what happens when politics try to command the seasons. Even today, China's obsession with food security is born from that wound. The lesson was clear: a nation can survive war, but not empty bowls. In the West, food became spectacle. Fast food chains rose like temples of convenience. McDonald's, KFC, Coca-Cola, all exported not just meals but mindsets. The hamburger became a flag. To eat American was to believe in abundance, speed, and optimism. No rations, no limits. The drive-thru replaced the bread line, and global appetite replaced local tradition. Culture was being consumed one bite at a time. Television turned chefs into celebrities. Packaging became propaganda. Cornflakes sold not nutrition but identity. Advertisements whispered, "You deserve more." It was a new kind of warfare, soft, shiny, irresistible. In Europe, brands like Nestle, Unilever, and Danone rose to match the empire of fast food with one of refinement. Cereal for breakfast, yogurt for health, coffee for sophistication. The marketing of appetite became the new diplomacy of the age. But food power was also literal. In the 1970s, when the US withheld grain shipments from the Soviet Union, it was as effective as any blockade. When oil prices soared, food prices followed. Every loaf of bread carried the story of global politics. Wheat from Kansas, fuel from Saudi Arabia, fertilizer from Russia. The dinner plate had become a world map. And yet, in the developing world, hunger persisted. Colonialism had ended, but dependency remained. Countries that once fed empires now imported their own staples. Cash crops, coffee, cocoa, sugar, replaced subsistence farming. Farmers grew what the world wanted, not what their children needed. The empire of appetite demanded obedience, and the price was hunger in new disguises. By the 1980s, the global South produced luxury for the North and starvation for itself. Still, food could heal as well as harm. Humanitarian aid expanded, convoys of grain, milk powder, and rice moving under the blue flag of the United Nations. Each sack carried not just calories but conscience. The same tools once used for dominance became instruments of mercy. And yet, every relief effort carried a question. Was this help or control? Even charity, when measured in tons, had politics baked in. Meanwhile, the supermarket became the citizen's empire. 1,000 brands, 1,000 flags of choice. People no longer needed to conquer land, they conquered aisles. In the space of a few generations, the global middle class learned to eat like kings. Exotic fruits in winter. Shrimp from the other side of the world. Chocolate from jungles they'd never see. The planet itself had become the pantry. And the cost was invisible: carbon, extinction, silence. But for all the power food held, it also revealed our fragility. Every famine, every drought, every supply chain break reminded the world how close comfort is to collapse. When shelves empty, illusions vanish. In 1974, when poor harvests and oil shocks caused a worldwide food crisis, nations panicked not because they were starving, but because they remembered what starvation meant. Governments began stockpiling grain like gold. In the empire of appetite, fear of hunger was the new hunger. And yet, the memory of rationing, of doing with less, still flickered in the background of modern abundance. Old people in post-war Europe saved crusts, froze leftovers, whispered, "Waste not." Their grandchildren scrolled menus on glowing screens, one click from a global buffet. History had moved from famine to feast, but the lesson was the same. Whoever controls the food controls the future. Imagine it now, a cargo ship cutting through the Pacific, 1972. Its hold is filled with wheat from Kansas, bound for Asia. Each grain of wheat is a seed of diplomacy, a whisper of empire. A dock worker leans on the railing, watching the horizon burn gold. He doesn't know he's carrying history. He only knows the smell of grain reminds him of home. Somewhere, far across the ocean, a family will bake bread from what he ships tonight. And without knowing it, the world will grow just a little more dependent. One meal at a time. The battlefield has changed. No bullets, no trenches, only hunger, and who gets to satisfy it. Welcome to the empire of appetite. For thousands of years, people ate to live. Now, in the new millennium, they live to eat. After centuries of famine, rationing, and reconstruction, the pendulum swung past abundance into obsession. Food no longer measured survival. It measured self. The world that once prayed for bread now argued about gluten. In the 1980s and 1990s, the supermarket became a stage and the kitchen, a mirror. To cook was to declare belief, in tradition, in purity, in rebellion. Every plate was a manifesto. The industrial food miracle that once promised convenience now provoked anxiety. People began reading ingredient lists like confessionals, looking for redemption in the fine print. The same generation that grew up on frozen dinners now demanded organic, local, free range. Abundance had made them suspicious of itself. Television fed the hunger for meaning. Cooking shows became cultural theater. Julia Child's warm practicality gave way to Gordon Ramsay's fury, Anthony Bourdain's wanderlust, and Nigella Lawson's sensuality. The chef became prophet and rock star, priest and rebel. Every sauté pan was a sermon on authenticity. To taste, the audience was told, was to understand. But beneath the glamour, something deeper stirred, a longing for connection in a world that now fed itself through screens. Restaurants turned into temples. Menus read like poetry, plated like sculpture. Foams, emulsions, edible flowers, cuisine had become art and spectacle. But outside the glowing kitchens of Michelin stars, another world grew heavier. Fast food chains multiplied, feeding billions for the price of a coin. The planet now produced enough calories for all, yet hunger persisted, not from scarcity but from inequality. The global table had room for everyone, but not everyone had a seat. By the 2000s, food had become politics. To eat was to vote, for the environment, for ethics, for identity. Vegans fought carnivores online. Farm-to-table collided with factory farming. Plastic forks became symbols of environmental sin. What once was private, a meal, became public performance. Instagram turned breakfast into branding. 1,000 cameras captured avocado toast while millions still searched for bread. The world no longer lacked food, it lacked perspective. Meanwhile, corporations learned to sell identity disguised as flavor. Zero sugar. Plant-based. Guilt-free. Each label was a promise, not of health, but of belonging. Marketing found a new way to colonize appetite, not by feeding the body but by feeding the ego. People didn't just buy food, they bought stories. Coffee was no longer caffeine, it was community. Chocolate wasn't indulgence, it was fairness. The wrapper became a flag of virtue. Globalization made the dinner table borderless. Sushi in Paris, pizza in Beijing, tacos in Stockholm, pho in New York. The planet ate together for the first time in history, and yet the more unified taste became, the more people hungered for distinction. Authentic became a word of worship and accusation. What was once survival had turned into culture war fought with chopsticks and hashtags. Food had become both bridge and barricade. Technology joined the feast. Apps delivered meals faster than hunger could form. Algorithms learned what you craved before you did. Artificial intelligence wrote recipes. Robots flipped burgers. In the digital age, convenience wasn't progress, it was addiction. The friction of hunger, once life's great teacher, had been erased. Now the only scarcity left was patience. And still, beneath the noise of branding and broadband, something human persisted, the quiet miracle of a shared meal. Families, friends, strangers still gathered around tables, passing plates, stories, laughter. Even as food became identity, it remained the oldest form of empathy. To feed someone was still to say, "I want you to live." The ritual endured, small and stubborn, glowing like a candle against the glare of consumption. But not all candles stay lit. By the 2020s, new crises loomed. Climate change, pandemics, supply chain collapse. Suddenly, the supermarket shelves that once seemed endless went bare again. Panicked buyers emptied aisles, hunting for flour, rice, yeast, the same ancient staples of survival. The memory of rationing flickered awake. People learned to bake bread again, to cook from scratch, to share what little they had with neighbors. It was history repeating, not as tragedy or farce but as reminder. The age of excess had cracked, revealing the same fragile hunger underneath. Social media filled with images of loaves cooling on windowsills, of gardens sprouting on balconies, of families cooking together for the first time in years. It was nostalgia disguised as necessity. The modern world had rediscovered its oldest comfort, the kitchen as sanctuary. In the middle of global chaos, stirring a pot became resistance. And perhaps that is the paradox of progress, that every abundance eventually circles back to the simplicity it forgot. We have more food than any generation before us, and yet we are starving for meaning, for silence, for presence at the table. Our plates are full, but our attention is empty. Imagine it now, a dinner in any city tonight. A glowing restaurant window. Inside, strangers lift forks and phones, photographing what they're about to consume. Outside, an old man sells roasted chestnuts on the corner. The smell drifts through the glass. No hashtags, no plating, no performance, just smoke, warmth, and memory. The customers glance up, then back down to their screens. The man smiles anyway. He knows what they've forgotten, that food doesn't need to be beautiful. It only needs to be shared. The age of excess is not about how much we eat. It's about what we've lost between bites. The silence, the gratitude, the connection. And maybe someday when the noise fades and the screens go dark, we'll remember that hunger was never the enemy. It was the reason we gathered in the first place. In the beginning, food was faith. Temples stored it. Kings taxed it. Gods demanded it. Every harvest was an offering, every famine a punishment. Then came the laws, Hammurabi's rations, Rome's grain dole, Egypt's granaries, and with them the idea that feeding people was power. For 5,000 years, humanity has lived at the mercy of its own appetite. Now, for the first time, we can feed everyone, and yet hunger remains. Not just in bellies, but in hearts. The story of food is the story of us. Our triumphs, our cruelties, our dreams of control. We invented agriculture and called it civilization. We industrialized hunger and called it progress. We mechanized nature and called it victory. But somewhere between the field and the factory, we forgot that every meal is a miracle, not a rite. In this century, food is no longer local. It's planetary. The rice in your bowl may come from Vietnam. The wheat in your bread from Ukraine. The coffee in your cup from Ethiopia. Your breakfast is the world condensed into flavor. Every bite is a chain of invisible hands. Farmers, truckers, packers, coders, financiers, all bound by hunger, all chasing the same promise. Tomorrow will taste better than today. And yet, tomorrow trembles. The planet groans under the weight of our appetite. Industrial farming consumes rivers, poisons soil, erases forests. A third of all food produced is wasted, rotting in bins while millions starve. Climate change twists the seasons, turning fertile plains into dust and floods. Droughts write their own kind of scripture, one of scarcity. We've built a world that feeds billions but not wisely. Too much for some. Too little for many, and always too late. Technology now stands where the gods once stood. We can grow meat without animals, milk without cows, crops without soil. We can design flavor molecule by molecule, feed the sky with drones, and cultivate protein in vats of light. Artificial intelligence can predict what we'll crave next week and grow it before we ask. It is brilliant and terrifying. Because if hunger once reminded us we were human, what happens when even hunger becomes optional? Some say the next revolution won't be agricultural or industrial, but ethical. That the real question isn't how we feed ourselves, it's why. What kind of species will we become when food no longer humbles us? When taste is unlimited, when scarcity is gone, when the earth can no longer speak for itself? Will we remember that feeding someone is the oldest form of kindness? Or will we mistake abundance for virtue? In a way, the future is already here. Cities sprout vertical farms, towers of lettuce glowing under artificial suns. Chefs design meals for Mars. Scientists engineer grains to survive apocalypse weather. And yet, in refugee camps, the smell of boiled rice still draws children like prayers. Even in the most advanced age, hunger refuses to disappear. It waits patiently at the edge of every civilization, whispering the same warning. You are only as stable as your next harvest. Memory is the one ingredient progress cannot replace. Every grandmother who saves crusts, every farmer who still blesses the soil, every child who learns to share, they carry the memory of famine inside them. Civilization's conscience lives in the kitchen. And maybe that's where the redemption is. Not in factories or apps, but in the act of feeding another person with your own hands. Because to cook is to remember. And to remember is to resist forgetting what hunger taught us. We began this story in the mud of Mesopotamia, where priests balanced ledgers of grain and silver under the eyes of stone gods. We traveled through Babylon's laws, Egypt's granaries, Rome's markets, India's temples, China's dynasties. We saw rice become ritual, bread become power, and hunger become weapon. And somewhere along the way we learned to replace survival with meaning. Every civilization that rose did so on a full stomach. Every one that fell did so on an empty one. But maybe the end isn't collapse. Maybe it's understanding. That food was never just fuel or culture or commodity, it was language. It spoke of trust, of gratitude, of belonging. It told us who we were and what we valued. Every meal said, we are alive. We are together. We still believe in tomorrow. And that language, older than any empire, is the one thing worth keeping. Imagine it. A long table under an open sky. No banners. No borders. Just people from every era, every place, every hunger. A Sumerian scribe. An Egyptian widow. A Roman baker. A medieval farmer. A Japanese soldier. A modern child. They sit together, passing bread, pouring wine, sharing stories. No one counts the portions. No one asks who deserves more. They eat in silence at first, then softly they begin to laugh. Because for the first time in all of history, the table is big enough. The world's last meal will not be a feast of gold or glory. It will be simple, bread, water, salt, shared without fear. And when the plates are empty, someone will look up and realize, hunger was never the enemy, it was the teacher. And what it taught us was this, that to feed is to forgive, to share is to remember, and to eat together is to survive. The future of hunger isn't about scarcity, it's about empathy. If we can remember that, if we can taste the lessons of every civilization before us, then maybe, just maybe, we won't need a last meal at all. We'll already be home.